Chapter 429. The strength of Celestial Seal Sect's seal path was that they could use special seal paper and seal sand to create seals with physical energy. Different talismans had different effects. When used against an enemy, it was as if one could slowly unleash the accumulated power of one's strength. What kind of seal essence could be comprehended, what kind of seal could be created, and what kind of seal could be used in an instant? This was cultivation. At this time, Feng Shuini released tens of thousands of seals. While each seal was of the same kind, it was astounding to be able to use physical energy to create such an astounding number of seals. What was most astounding was Feng Shuini's willingness and decisiveness. Zhang, he had been cultivating the Tao of talismans for a long time. He knew very well that even if it was a simple talisman, it would take a very long time to complete it by using vital qi to adjust the talisman sand. He did not know how many years Feng Shuini had accumulated these tens of thousands of seals. So many years of hard work, and he used them all in a moment. This was boldness. He was also like a general who dared to shoot all the arrows in the army in an instant. This was courage. No matter what, Zhang Yi felt that his senior sect brother was very strong. And the power of these seals was also very strong. The tens of thousands of seals danced in the air like peach blossoms. Then these seals vaporized and turned to wild primal energies of the universe. Among the wild primal energies of the universe, many peach-red rays of light appeared like a miracle. Space seemed to start to split apart and gave off hoarse and unpleasant sounds. The power that Feng Shuini showed in this moment could not be measured by his cultivation. The eyes of many Celestial Seal Sect students were filled with fanatical light. In their view, if Feng Shuini's power was used on the battlefield, he could not just cause great damage to large armies. He could even pose a great threat to some peak Realm 6 and even Realm 7 cultivators when they least expected it. Facing these tens of thousands of seals, the youth from Yellow Heaven Daoist sect threw out a seal in a seemingly clumsy manner. It was really like a farmer throwing mud in the field, throwing out a talisman without any sense of beauty. A yellow seal. There was only a chi sound. The yellow talisman was instantly torn to shreds by the powerful force, as if it couldn't stop the power of the tens of thousands of talismans from spreading. It gave people the feeling that when the pink light landed on the youth's body would be torn to shreds like the talisman. But at this moment, Zhang Yi sensed something and looked up at the sky. Many Celestial Seal Sect cultivators also quickly looked up. Everyone who raised their heads saw the sky turn yellow. The originally blue sky above had turned yellow, as if a huge yellow talisman paper had formed in the sky. The youth who had thrown out a talisman with an unsightly posture withdrew his hand at this moment. He flicked his fingers several times at the same time. A layer of yellow light descended from the yellow sky, blocking his path. This scene was very simple, but even Zhang Yi felt as if he had casually taken a very powerful talisman from the yellow sky above and tossed it out. It was like pulling out a small talisman from a large talisman. This layer of yellow light could not completely stop Feng Shuini's power and immediately collapsed. But it still won some time for the youth. The youth's hand moved again. Then another layer of yellow light came down. After one layer, there was another layer. The youth still gave people the feeling of clumsiness, but he was methodical like he was skillfully weaving cloth. Murong Xiaoyi's fanaticism quickly dissipated into shock and incomprehension. Regardless of which layer of yellow light the youth pulled out, they could not completely stop Feng Shuini's power. But he was safe. He was dispelling Feng Shuini's power layer by layer. Even more importantly, the power in the yellow sky above did not seem to decrease much. What seal is this? Someone had already cried out in shock. This youth's heavenly seal seemed to never run out. Feng Shuini's face paled slightly. He felt he could not directly pose a threat to this youth. So he looked up, and a pink seal flew out of his left sleeve. This seal turned into a beam of divine light and stabbed into the yellow sky above. There was a loud boom. An enormous golden flower appeared in the sky. Each petal of the golden flower was a thick bolt of golden lightning. This seal was one of the most powerful true seals of Celestial Seal Sect, the Lightning Peach God Seal. The Grand Masters of Celestial Seal sect had comprehended it from the patterns in the core of the peach wood struck by lightning to form the powerful lightning-attracting true seal. Yet the golden lightning spread in the yellow sky, like icing on the cake, and had no effect on him. This youth from Yellow Heaven Daoist sect still did not care as he took out seals. His seemingly clumsy posture actually had a very smooth rhythm. Every layer of yellow light that fell was like a weak flying sword that he had thrown out. But even the weakest flying sword was still a flying sword. In the span of a dozen breaths, the peach-red light beam that was heading towards him could no longer threaten him, and he began his counterattack. Beam after beam of yellow light started to fall towards Feng Shuani. From the view of many Celestial Seal sect disciples standing to the side, each of his minute movements seemed to be plucking an enormous yellow crystal sword from the sky and slashing towards Feng Shuani. Feng Shuani took a deep breath. The vital energy in his body surged out, and the golden seal that he had been holding between his left fingers disappeared. A golden line silently appeared behind the youth. This golden line was not a product of pure vital energy and primal energies of the universe, but gave off a true metal presence. It was a completely melted metal stream. The Chu dynasty had a powerful artifact called the Vermilion Bird Needle. This artifact looked like a fiery red needle on the outside, but after it shot out, it would spin violently. The astounding heat it produced would not melt the outer shell, but would turn the inner core into molten liquid. In the end, in the moment of a great collision, the molten liquid would spray out from the tip of the needle at terrifying speed. This kind of power could even penetrate and destroy the sword nucleus of a flying sword. Feng Shuani's seal had a similar power. This true seal was one of the dozens of true seals of Celestial Seal sect, the Molten Mountain Armor-Breaking Seal. This youth from Yellow Heaven Daoist sect sensed the killing intent behind him. He turned around, but his movements were still clumsy. He still pulled down a seal from the yellow sky above like he was pulling on a string. This time it was not yellow light, but a white light. A white cold flow charged towards the golden line. With a hiss, a layer of white frost formed on the golden line, and then the frost immediately vaporized. Then there was another white stream of air. One after another, more than 10 streams of white qi surged up. The golden thread emitted a crisp cracking sound and turned into countless fragments, bursting apart. Feng Shuani stopped attacking and remained silent. The entire place was also silent. Many cultivators of Celestial Seal sect could use many seals at once, but no one could be as fast as this youth from Yellow Heaven Daoist sect when it came to using seals in succession. The greater the power, the more time was needed to buffer. For example, the heavier a blacksmith's hammer was, the more power and time it would take for him to strike again. But this Yellow Heaven Daoist sect youth's seal essences were not astoundingly powerful, but they were very strong and did not seem to take much time to cast. He was able to suppress this youth with a single blow, but it was impossible for him to defeat his opponent. Furthermore, when his opponent counterattacked, it was impossible for him to block every single blow from his opponent. An opponent like this, if Feng Shuani could not win, who could win against him? Murong Xiaoyi looked dazedly at this Yellow Heaven Daoist sect youth. Several names appeared in her mind, but in the next moment, she lost confidence in them. Zhang Yi looked at the Yellow Heaven Daoist sect youth. Because he was too impressed, he forgot shame. Chapter 430. There were many cultivators in Celestial Seal sect who could defeat and even kill this Yellow Heaven Daoist sect youth, but those people were not of the same generation as this youth. You lost. In the silence, this Yellow Heaven Daoist sect youth said seriously to Feng Shuani. Then his gaze swept across all the people of Celestial Seal sect present. His gaze seemed to automatically filter through the old people of Celestial Seal sect and landed on all the young disciples of Celestial Seal sect. Then he asked, "Who else wants to come?" No one responded. Feng Shuani was one of the best of Celestial Seal sect's young disciples of this generation. Also, when he was fighting this Yellow Heaven Daoist sect youth, he had decisively used the true seals he had forged for many years. Even the other people in the sect who were as famous as him were confident they could not withstand such power. An indescribable emotion spread through the crowd. Murong Xiaoyi felt humiliated. Was all a Celestial Seal sect going to be humiliated by this youth who seemed to have just wiped the mud off his feet and walked out of the fields? However, at this moment, the youth from the Yellow Heaven Taoist sect raised his eyebrows when he saw that no one was replying. He said seriously, "If no one is willing to accept the challenge, then you should abide by the agreement and give this sect to us." Murong Xiaoyi's face paled and then flushed red. Many young disciples of Celestial Seal sect had similar expressions. "Let me try." At this time, a voice sounded. This voice did not have a pure Yin accent, but a Qin accent that many people of the Yin dynasty disliked. Everyone's gazes fell on that person in unison. Zhang Yi also turned his head and looked over. Just by listening to the voice, he already knew that it was Su Qin. Just like how Zhang Yi had passed the exam and entered Celestial Seal sect, how Su Qin had entered Celestial Seal sect was a mystery to most people in Celestial Seal sect. However, unlike Zhang Yi, Su Qin's cultivation progress was very fast, so fast that it made people jealous. In just a few months, he had left behind his classmates who had joined half a year earlier than him. Under the arrangements of the Celestial Seal sect teachers, he was studying with the Celestial Seal sect students who had joined 2 years ago. In Celestial Seal sect, he clearly did not fit in. Even though he was standing in the crowd, he still felt a little lonely. There were no friends around him who could stand by his side. His hands hung in his sleeves, making it impossible to see the disability of his left hand. His hair was very black, which made his face appear excessively fair. Su Qin's face was originally very handsome. At this time, his overly white face had a faint blush, which made people feel that he was strangely beautiful. However, in the eyes of the young man from the Yellow Heaven Taoist sect, all of this could be ignored. "All right." He looked at Su Qin, who was standing on the stone steps not far from him, and nodded simply. He said, "Then you can attack." Su Qin smiled and nodded in greeting. In the next moment, the dust on the path in front of him was blown up by the power coming out of his body and swept outwards. At the same time, a fiery red true seal flew out of his left sleeve. This true seal burned like a fallen leaf in the flying dust and disappeared in a flash, not even leaving behind ashes. A streak of red true fire silently appeared in the air to the left of the Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth. Seeing the red true fire appear, many people in the surrounding crowd made incomprehensible sounds. Su Qin had left most of the students in the dust this year far behind him, but he had not been in the sect for long. In many people's view, he could not be as strong as Fang Xuanyi and could not represent Celestial Seal sect in battle. Especially at this time, this red true fire was the most ordinary true fire seal of all of Celestial Seal sect's true seals. Even Fang Xuanyi, who had tens of thousands of seals flying together, was not a match for this Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth. What was the use of this true fire seal? The youth from Yellow Heaven Taoist sect could not understand. So he had no interest in even looking at this true fire. His left hand moved slightly, and a yellow light fell from the yellow sky above. Then it turned into a yellow stone and smashed towards the primordial fire. Using a stone to defeat fire was a common tactic in Celestial Seal sect seal path. But what no one had expected was that the moment the yellow stone accurately hit the true fire, the red true fire suddenly twisted as though it had a life of its own, and several straight seal essences appeared inside. The true fire suddenly gathered and split into 5 different directions. Amidst the cries of disbelief, this ball of red true fire condensed into 5 thin small swords. With multiple cracking sounds, the 5 glowing little swords made from true fire pierced through the falling yellow stone and stabbed at 5 different places on the Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth's body. Zhang Yi also exclaimed in shock. He did not exclaim because he saw Su Qin's incredible moves, but because he worried about the life of this Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth. This distance was too close. With a distance of less than 3 meters, these 5 swords were no different from 5 flying swords. The youth from Yellow Heaven Taoist sect didn't expect this at all. With a roar, a yellow talisman flew out from his sleeve. At the same time, his body flew backwards. Boom! 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 Dozens of streams of true fire came out of a patch of yellow sand. Several streams of fire sputtered onto the young man's body. All the people in the immortal talisman saw several charred wounds appear on the young man's body. The youth shouted and steadied his stumbling body. But before this, Su Qin's vital energy had furiously surged out of his left hand. 5 or 6 true fire seals flew out of his left hand. His left hand's fingers were twisted in an ugly manner, and people would feel disgust when they saw it. But the vital energy that charged out of his fingertips also flew out in a twisted path and attacked the true fire seals. These true fire seals disappeared one after another. Streaks of true fire appeared one after another in front of the yellow heaven Taoist sect youth. Then they turned into red true fire swords. The flying speed of these swords was very fast and very sharp, and they appeared in different order, appearing in different directions. So these true fire swords formed a rain of swords. Murong Xiaoyi's beautiful eyes were wide. She started to understand that this youth from Qin had used his crippled hand to create an extraordinary seal essence and turned these ordinary true fire seals into powerful sword seals. Thinking of her classmate Zhang Yi, who had caused everyone's disgust, she felt great admiration for Su Qin and even more disgust for Zhang Yi. Many people reacted faster than her. So when Su Qin's first true fire seal changed, some people around Zhang Yi looked at Zhang Yi differently. But at this time, Zhang Yi did not notice the expressions and gazes of the people around him. The yellow heaven Taoist sect youth was wounded, and his movements were clearly slower. At this time, Su Qin clearly pursued pure speed. He wanted to be fast, so this yellow heaven Taoist sect youth could not deal with him and finish the battle in an instant. But his instincts were not so simple. He felt that this yellow heaven Taoist sect youth would not lose so easily. He just felt that a disciple of yellow heaven Taoist sect who had come to celestial seal sect after 2 generations and 100 years of silence would not be so easily defeated by a true seal that had changed. It was also at this moment that a wave of exclamations sounded. His pupils contracted violently. The yellow heaven Taoist sect youth spread his arms. Many sparkling threads of light appeared on his body. These bright threads of light came out of his body, spread upwards, and connected to the yellow sky above. The yellow sky was like a huge kite that was being pulled by him with countless glowing threads. Su Qin's expression changed dramatically. The moment these bright threads of light came out of the youth's body, his true fire swords started to shatter. The true fire swords landed on these threads of light and were cut into pieces. The shattered true fire moved forward and was cut into even smaller pieces by the threads of light. In the end, they turned to thin heat and dissipated around the youth. The youth's body trembled in pain. He gritted his teeth and glanced at Su Qin. One of the threads of light in his hand seemed to suddenly snap, but a powerful force seemed to be pulled down from the sky. As this thread of light snapped, it swept in front of Su Qin. There was a loud bang. A wave of energy exploded. Su Qin's body flew backwards, passing over all the onlookers and falling far away. Chapter 431. A white true seal landed behind the flying Su Qin, turning into a white cloud with a peaceful presence. It did not just support Su Qin's body, but also softened the impact on Su Qin to the greatest extent so that Su Qin's body slowly landed. The person who had attacked was a teacher from the True Seal sect. The talisman easily displayed his powerful cultivation level. However, even the teacher who had attacked had an extremely ugly expression. In this teacher's perception, the countless threads of light on this youth from Yellow Heaven Taoist sect were countless seals. Also, in his perception, the power of these seals already existed outside this youth's body, but they did not erupt or dissipate. They only moved according to this youth's thoughts. What kind of seal path was this? How could such a seal path exist in the world? Su Qin's body silently landed under the support of the soft cloud energy. Blood silently seeped out of his mouth. The depths of his eyes were also filled with extreme disappointment and shock. For him, this was a chance to receive the recognition and respect of all the young people of Celestial Seal Sect. Yet he had never expected this Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth to show such a move. Because he was so disappointed and shocked, he could not help but show a hint of hatred on his face. The bright threads of light flowing out of the youth's body did not disappear. As the young man's hands slowly descended, the strands of light pulled the yellow sky above him even lower. These threads of light seemed to grow out of his body and gave people an eerie and terrifying feeling. All the young students of Celestial Seal sect looked at these profound and indescribable threads of light and were speechless. They could not understand the seal essence in these threads of light. This at least meant that this Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth's understanding of seal scripts and the paths of many primal energies of the universe was far above them. The Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth's wounds were scorched black, and large amounts of flesh had been burned away. He was undoubtedly in great pain, but he still took deep breaths, steadied himself, and then said, "Who else is coming?" His voice vibrated in the light around him and passed into the ears of these Celestial Seal sect youths. These Celestial Seal sect youths inexplicably felt their chests tighten as though the voice had changed and stuffed balls of energy into their chests. Yet when this voice reached Zhang Yi's ears, a part of Zhang Yi's energy suddenly lit up. Some kind of primordial qi resonated strangely. Then, Zhang Yi felt that something in his sleeve started to glow and heat up. Zhang Yi's mind exploded like thunder. He suddenly reacted and instinctively said, "He is the seal." At this time, in the empty space of Celestial Seal sect, other than the youth's voice, there was only the sound of heavy breathing. His voice, which carried a Qin accent, was very abrupt at this time. Murong Xiaoyi suddenly turned around. She could not understand the meaning of the words. She instinctively thought that it was Su Qin who had spoken. Yet when she turned around, she realized that the speaker was Zhang Yi, whom everyone looked down on. The Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth suddenly looked up at Zhang Yi standing at the back of the crowd. Bearing everyone's burning gazes, Zhang Yi unconsciously bowed his head slightly. But in his perception, his energy and the sword in his sleeve grew hotter and brighter. The light and heat in his perception started to remind him of his responsibility at this time. "I want to try." He gripped the burning hot sword in his sleeve and said seriously. There was an uproar, especially the classmates who had just walked out of the lecture hall with him. They all looked at him like they were looking at an idiot. "Do you know what you are doing?" Among the students closest to him, a girl with a pale face said in a cold voice, "Do you think that by doing this, you can change people's opinion of you in the slightest?" This young woman's emotions represented the emotions of all the young students of Celestial Seal sect. If this was the battlefield when several of their sect brothers fell, they could show some courage in facing death. But with each Celestial Seal sect disciple that fell, Celestial Seal sect would have more humiliation. Zhang Yi was not stupid. He understood what this young woman and his classmates meant. He was usually a humble person, but this time, he did not back down. "I want to try." He faced the young girl who tried to stop him and sincerely said, "I might be able to win." "You can win?" When someone heard his answer, he couldn't bear it anymore and shouted angrily, "You can't even comprehend the talisman intent that all your classmates can easily comprehend, and you still say you can win?" Zhang Yi was slightly ashamed, but the burning sword in his hand seemed to remind him not to retreat. So he took a deep breath and said, "If you can win, I will not have to come out and try." What he said was his true intentions. However, when these words entered the ears of all of his schoolmates, they instead drew even greater anger. Murong Xiaoyi could not even breathe. She gritted her teeth and was about to scold Zhang Yi when a voice sounded. "I will fight him, no matter what you think. I will fight him." The youth of Yellow Heaven Taoist sect faced everyone's gaze and slowly repeated, "I really do not understand." This young man still had a dumb look on his face. He looked at everyone in front of him and said, "Even I can see that he is a very humble person. He indeed has some confidence and wants to give it a try. Why can't you all see it?" "He has always been the worst in our group," one of Zhang Yi's classmates could not help but shout. The youth of Yellow Heaven Taoist sect glanced at him and said, "Before this, in your eyes, Yellow Heaven Taoist sect is many times worse than Celestial Seal sect. No one spoke again. Zhang Yi had started to walk. He was a humble gentleman and knew how to be humble. But not many people knew that when he decided on something, he would be more determined than anyone else. He walked out under the angry and hateful gazes of many people. He walked in front of this youth of Yellow Heaven Taoist sect. Then he bowed in thanks to this Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth and asked, "This one is Zhang Yi. May I ask for senior sect brother's name?" The Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth bowed in return and said, "Yu Yi." In the crowd, Murong Xiaoyi was stunned. She finally realized that while she had experienced 2 battles in front of her, no one seemed to care about the name of this Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth, much less call this youth senior sect brother, like Zhang Yi. Senior sect brother Yu is too strong, so I will attack first. Zhang Yi looked respectfully at this Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth Yu Yi and said. Yu Yi's expression grew solemn, and he said, "Please." Murong Xiaoyi's heart beat violently. Before this, she had never thought highly of Zhang Yi, but for some reason, she felt that something unusual was about to happen. A person's intuition, especially a woman's, was usually correct. Just as Zhang Yi nodded his head in greeting, everyone felt a dazzling glare. Zhang Yi's right sleeve gave off blinding light. Murong Xiaoyi tried to open her eyes. She saw that the light came from the small sword Zhang Yi was holding in his right hand. Her first impression of this small sword was that it was a rough stone sword that had been polished from a hard stone. However, at this moment it was emitting light. This light was as bright as moonlight, but it was even brighter than sunlight. Clenching the stone sword that was emitting countless bright lights, half of Zhang Yi's body seemed to be burning, as if he was melting into the light. Amidst the gasps that could not be suppressed, Zhang Yi solemnly drew his sword. There were no finesse. He flew straight forward, thrusting his sword towards Liu Yi, who was right in front of him. Yu Yi's expression grew grave. He let out a low growl and waved his hands forward. Countless sparkling and translucent rays of light, carrying a mysterious power, swept towards Zhang Yi's body like waves of water. Zhang Yi's movements did not change at all. The sparkling and translucent rays of light that seemed to be traveling on different paths, surprisingly, came into contact with the sword in his hand one by one. There was a soft sound. When the first glowing line of light landed on his sword, or rather, when the small sword in his hand stabbed the glowing line of light, the small sword in his hand dimmed and lost some light. Chapter 432. Because it was too bright and sparkling. When Zhang Yi's small sword appeared in everyone's sight, it seemed to be carved from the most perfect jade in the world. But when the first ray of light came into contact with his small sword, as the light dimmed, a mark appeared on his small sword like it was being corroded. That mark revealed its original stone color, and the yuan qi swirling around it was like the dust of a stone that had been cut. As more and more sparkling lights collided with the small sword in Zhang Yi's hand, the sparkling and bright small sword became dimmer and dimmer, as if it was turning from a beautiful jade back to a hard stone. Yet no one dared to scold Zhang Yi. Even Murong Xiaoyi's eyes were filled with shock and awe as she looked at Zhang Yi and Zhang Yi's sword. Even she could sense the power of Zhang Yi's sword, this stab. She sensed the profound seal essence, but could not understand it. She could not understand why Zhang Yi's sword was so simple and straightforward, yet he was able to hit every ray of light that came at him. She could not understand, but Yu Yi from Yellow Heaven Taoist sect could. Zhang Yi's sword essence seemed to cover the entire world. While his mind and sword essence were straightforward, they forcibly changed the laws and direction of the primal energies of the universe in this part of the world. Also, Zhang Yi's body and this sword flowed with a presence he was familiar with. So when Zhang Yi's sword became slower and slower, and the sword color became dimmer, as though it was about to become an ordinary stone sword, his expression became more and more serious. The power accumulated in his body surged out without reservation, pouring into the glowing lines of light. Zhang Yi's expression did not change. The stone sword in his hand grew dimmer, but in his perception, the light in his energy sea grew brighter and hotter. Following his thoughts, The light filling his energy, Xi surged out along his meridians and into the stone sword in his hand. The dim stone sword in his hand shone again. The extremely oppressive atmosphere was broken by bursts of exclamations. Many people stopped breathing and looked at the sword in Zhang Yi's hand in disbelief. In their perception, what was flowing out of Zhang Yi's body was not quintessential essence, but Tao talismans. What was even more incomprehensible to them was that these talismans did not need to be the same as ordinary talismans. They did not need to be stimulated by true essence to gather heaven and earth yuan qi before finally displaying destructive power. At this moment, the talismans that flowed out of Zhang Yi's body were power itself, power that was directly injected into the sword. The stone sword that was almost stagnant in the air continued to glow and then continued forward. Louis took a deep breath and looked at Zhang Yi and the sword in Zhang Yi's hands with admiration. The reason why he admired Zhang Yi was not only because he could comprehend such talisman intent and display such a powerful sword. Even more importantly, he could not imagine that Zhang Yi could display such a powerful sword and maintain such a posture under the ridicule of his classmates. He knew that at this time, he and Zhang Yi had become a competition of pure cultivation and resolve. So he did not hold back. All the glowing light that flowed out of his body flew toward Zhang Yi and faced the sword that was coming closer. The stone sword in Zhang Yi's hand instantly released countless clouds of dust, as if countless fireworks had been ignited at the same time. His arm and entire body started to tremble violently. Just as he unconsciously considered if his body could endure it, a mouthful of blood seeped out of his mouth. The light of the stone sword in his hand immediately disappeared. All the magnificence returned to simplicity. The sword in his hand turned into a very small and ordinary stone sword. There were many glowing lines of light in front of the stone sword. In everyone's imagination, if the sword were to advance any further, not only would the sword be cut in half, but Zhang Yi would also suffer an unimaginable injury. But Zhang Yi did not retreat. For him, regardless of whether it was the sword essence of Min Mountain Sword Sect or the seal essence he comprehended in Celestial Seal Sect, they were external objects he could use. But this sword and his will were himself, his life bond. He decisively stabbed at the last few glowing lines of light in front of him. Many enormous forces cut at the stone sword in his hand. Dust rose from the stone sword. But what caused everyone to stop breathing was that this seemingly ordinary stone sword did not leave any marks. But Zhang Yi's body shook again, and he coughed up blood. The soles of his boots exploded. His soles rubbed against the stone on the ground and created a spray of blood. But only now did a wave of pleasure form in Zhang Yi's body. The sword will of his sword was truly incisive and vivid at this moment, from borrowing an external object to using his own life. In this moment, he was connected to the sword in his hand. This sword truly turned from Shui Wangshu's sword into his own sword. Sincerity, respect, nostalgia, protection, inheritance, and so on and so forth. In the end, this sword was truly passed down to him and became his sword. A powerful presence of new life spread from the sword. It was only at this moment that the pair of old eyes that were looking at Zhang Yi from the top of the mountain began to be filled with emotion and admiration. At the same time, a few sincere sighs sounded beside the owner of the pair of eyes. The sword essence of Min Mountain Sword Sect, the seal methods of Celestial Seal Sect, and the sword of White Goat Cave merged into one on this simple and humble youth. There was a loud boom. The patch of yellow sky above Lu Yi's head collapsed, turning into countless streams of yellow energy that flew out. Louis could not stand steadily and fell back to sit on the ground. The wounds he had received from the successive battles also burst forth at this time. He spat out a mouthful of bloody mist, appearing extremely bright under the rays of sunlight. Zhang Yi's sword light continued to move forward. It was like a curved goat's horn as it swept past Lu Yi's body. The sword light left behind clear marks in the air. Zhang Yi put away his sword. He looked at Lu Yi, who was sitting on the ground with an apologetic gaze. Lu Yi felt sorrow, But when he looked at Zhang Yi, who was also covered in blood, his eyes were full of respect. He prepared to admit defeat very convincingly. The moment he said, Murong Xiaoyi and all of Zhang Yi's classmates felt indescribably complicated emotions. Murong Xiaoyi looked unblinkingly at Zhang Yi. She was filled with shock. Then she thought of her previous attitude towards him and started to feel ashamed. I have lost. To everyone's surprise, Zhang Yi spoke at this time. He stood in front of Lu Yi and said, I have lost because many of my attacks did not come from Celestial Seal Sect. There was an uproar. Murong Xiaoyi's eyes were wide. She opened her mouth, but could not speak. She did not know what to say. Just now, Zhang Yi was undoubtedly the hero of Celestial Seal Sect. As long as he stood there and accepted the other's surrender, he was naturally the hero of Celestial Seal Sect and the person all young students admired, including her. If Celestial Seal Sect lost, they would have to give up the mountain. Yet Zhang Yi was admitting defeat. She could not understand, but for some reason, she did not hate Zhang Yi at this time. A strange feeling spread through her body. Lu Yi stilled. What he was about to say was interrupted. Then his face became very serious. He pushed himself up and looked gravely at Zhang Yi. He said, a win is a win, a loss is a loss. No matter what your attack is like, you come from Celestial Seal Sect. You are a disciple of Celestial Seal Sect. So, I still admit defeat. The chaotic noises instantly disappeared and returned to silence. Many Celestial Seal Sect disciples present, especially Zhang Yi's classmates, felt great guilt. They unconsciously thought, many times, even when they first saw Zhang Yi, they naturally rejected Zhang Yi and never thought of him as a Celestial Seal Sect disciple like them. Zhang Yi looked at Lu Yi and felt great respect. At this time, he did not know what to say. At this time, an old voice came from the mountain path. None of you have lost. Hearing this voice, Zhang Yi's eyes widened in disbelief. He instinctively turned around. Chapter 433. Sect Master. Almost all the cultivators of Celestial Seal Sect bowed deeply when they saw the face of the old man walking down the mountain path. Everyone seemed to be shorter at this time. Only Zhang Yi stood dazed where he was, like a crane among chickens. The sunlight landed on the old man. Looking at the old man's familiar figure and face, countless scenes flashed through Zhang Yi's mind. This old man appeared familiar, but also unfamiliar. He still stood dazedly, but finally started to understand why he could enter Celestial Seal Sect and become a disciple of Celestial Seal Sect despite his terrible results in the exam. But he had not had enough time to think. He could not understand why this old man had spent so much effort to travel with him from the Qin to the Yin. The old man in the sunlight looked at the dazed Zhang Yi, his gaze warmer than the sunlight. He passed through the respectful crowd and walked in front of Zhang Yi and Lu Yi. Lu Yi looked at this gentle old man and could not connect him to the strongest cultivator in the Yin right now. Mysterious, cunning, powerful, and other adjectives seemed to have nothing to do with this old man. None of them lost. When this old man stopped in front of him and Zhang Yi for a long time, he finally recovered from his daze and asked, "What do you mean?" Murong Xiaoyi suddenly grew worried. For some reason, she was not worried about the ownership of Celestial Seal Sect, but Lu Yi and Zhang Yi. The old man looked kindly at Lu Yi and said emotionally, "Open the bag and you will understand." Lu Yi stilled again. "Open it and you will know." The old man looked at him and said seriously, "You will understand the true relationship between Yellow Heaven Taoist Sect and Celestial Seal Sect. You will also understand the relationship between your ancestral teacher and my master." Lu Yi's breathing suddenly sped up. Almost all the Celestial Seal Sect cultivators' breathing sped up. They could not understand the old man's words, but they felt that the old man's words contained great secrets. The answer was in the pouch left behind by the ancestral master of Yellow Heaven Taoist Sect on Yi's body. Louis looked up at the old man again. Then, he took a deep breath and resolutely opened the brocade pouch. There was a yellowed sheepskin scroll in the brocade pouch. At a glance, he was certain that the handwriting on the small sheepskin scroll was indeed from his ancestor. When he unfolded the small sheepskin scroll and began to read the handwriting on it, he began to understand why the founder had left behind so many notes. Is that so? His hands began to tremble slightly as he spoke in a daze. His eyes were also very blank, like a lost child who didn't know where to go. Strictly speaking, this is a scam. The old man looked apologetically at him and said slowly, but this is a well-intentioned lie, a lie that can prevent Celestial Seal Sect from declining. So please don't blame your ancestor. All the Celestial Seal Sect disciples looked dazedly at the old man and Louis. They wanted an answer. The atmosphere was too quiet and suffocating. Fortunately, the old man did not make them wait for too long. He spoke in a clear voice so that every Celestial Seal Sect disciple could hear him clearly. Back then, Yamcha came out of the mountain to establish Yellow Heaven Daoist sect, not out of pride, but a deliberate arrangement. The reason was that Celestial Seal Sect was the strongest sect in the Yen back then. In the view of the sect master back then, when something is at its peak, it is easier for it to decline, just like how a dynasty that is invincible is easier to decay and die. Only with external pressure can there be improvement. After a pause, the old man's gaze swept across the faces of Zhang, Yi, and the other Celestial Seal Sect disciples. He said slowly, Yellow Heaven Daoist sect is Celestial Seal Sect. Celestial Seal Sect is still Celestial Seal Sect. So no matter which generation, whether Yellow Heaven Daoist sect wins over Celestial Seal Sect or Celestial Seal Sect wins over Yellow Heaven Daoist sect, it is Celestial Seal Sect's victory. So this is purposefully establishing an enemy sect? Someone finally reacted and could not help but speak. Not sticking to one pattern is the true meaning of the seal path. The old man looked up into the sky. The sea is large. No matter what your background is, as long as you are a true Celestial Seal Sect disciple, your accomplishments can create Celestial Seal Sect. Hearing the old man's words, many Celestial Seal Sect teachers had ashamed gazes, especially when they saw Zhang Yi out of the corner of their eyes. Only now did they finally understand why Celestial Seal Sect could accept a Qin person like Zhang Yi. There are thousands of paths to the path. If you are restricted to those dead seals, you are truly a pool of stagnant water. In the end, you are just walking on the path of your predecessors. How much can you accomplish? The old man turned to look at Zhang Yi and said with praise. Zhang Yi was inexplicably moved. Looking at the old man, he understood the cause and effect. He knew that the old man's many schemes along the way were all tests for him. He opened his mouth, but could not speak. Since you are here, take things as they come. Since you understand the meaning of your ancestral master and my master, you should know this is all for Celestial Seal Sect. Stay and cultivate in Celestial Seal Sect. The old man looked at the similarly speechless Lu Yi and smiled. He said, I give you Celestial Seal Sect's mountain. I give you Celestial Seal Sect's mountain. His voice was calm, but it was filled with a spirit that caused one to admire him from the bottom of their hearts as it reverberated through the mountains. Lu Yi's body seemed to be struck by lightning. He trembled and instinctively bowed. Sect Master. You too, come with me? The old man smiled faintly and started to walk up the mountain path. At the same time, he followed Zhang Yi and Lu Yi. I'm not giving you this mountain for free. When they were halfway up the mountain, the old man didn't turn around. Instead, he slowly said in a soft voice, to be able to cultivate so hard just because of some dying wishes and challenge such a large sect alone, I am relieved to hand this mountain to you. If I give it to any one of you, when I close my eyes in the future, I can put down the burden of Celestial Seal Sect without worry. Now there are two of you. You respect each other and will naturally help each other. The Yellow Heaven Daoist seal is a seal for cultivation, but also the formation eye of this mountain. The old man stopped in front of a thatched hut. Just by glancing at the door of the thatched hut, the ordinary bluestone lit up and emitted a yellow luster, which was exactly the same color as the talisman used by Lu Yi. Lu Yi's body shook again. Just from the presence coming from the door, he knew that the old man was giving him the formation eye of this seal mountain. He was truly giving this mountain to him. When someone defends, someone will attack. The old man turned around and looked at Zhang Yi. He smiled slightly and said, "Your cultivation of vital energy has not reached the great accomplishment, but your sword essence has reached the great accomplishment. In the future, you will have to rely on this sword of yours." Zhang Yi opened his mouth. The old man shook his head and interrupted him. "Do not belittle yourself." Zhang Yi and Lu Yi exchanged a look. "Before it rains, you have to plan." The old man smiled in satisfaction. He looked at the patch of rain clouds above the cage and said, "It is my fortune to have two students like you so quickly." Zhang Yi inexplicably thought of the matters of Yellow Heaven Daoist sect and Celestial Seal sect and Su Qin. He could not help but look up at the old man's side profile and asked, "Then my senior sect brother, when someone helps, there will naturally be someone who forces them." The old man smiled and said, "Su Qin is not weak. He will fulfill his role very well. As for the future victory or defeat, there are two of you and only one of him, so I am very at ease." Zhang Yi and Lu Yi were speechless again. They looked at this old man who was looking at the Yin Xanadu and felt that this old man's figure was enormous. Chapter 434. As they headed northwest from Chongling, the grass and trees grew withered and yellow. Many soldiers of the Imperial Guard Army looked at Ding Ning's back with puzzlement. Since the start of this migration, most of the soldiers of the Imperial Guard Army had great respect for Ding Ning. The highest general of the army, Guofeng, was Ding Ning's advisor. In many armies of the Qin, many of the orders of the advisor would become orders that the entire army would follow. From leaving Chongling until now, all the orders of this troop came from Ding Ning's mouth. But in the view of these soldiers, Ding Ning had not shown any stunning aspects, and would only do some incomprehensible actions. Just now, they had passed the valley that was the easiest to ambush. Ahead was a large plain, and there were only some scattered farming villages. Yet Ding Ning had them stop, and had stopped for a long time. But the highest general of this army, Guofeng, did not think so, because he knew very well how many things Ding Ning had done in these seemingly peaceful days that even he was shocked by. "You are certain they will act here?" He looked at the flat plain ahead, and then looked gravely at Ding Ning and asked, "These are some cultivators of Flowing Sand sect. Hiding in a place like this is no different to hiding in other places. What they fear the most are the seal weapons in the army." Ding Ning turned to look at him and nodded. He said, "Even more importantly, after passing this plain, we will reach the border city. They feel that they will not have a chance to act after this. They have some conflict among themselves, so they will act here." Guofeng could not understand how Ding Ning was so sure that the cultivators who had been discovered by Ding Ning a few days ago had started to fight. But since Ding Ning's judgments had not been wrong in the past few days, he chose to believe Ding Ning. "Why are we being forced to fight?" Nangong Kaishu, who was standing on the other side of Ding Ning, frowned and asked softly with a murderous expression. "Some enemies are not permanent." Ding Ning turned to look at her and said slowly, "Some enemies only come with orders. If they can't fulfill the orders, or just happen to miss the opportunity, they will be killed. These people may not be your enemies in the future, and you may not encounter them in future battles. Some assassins might not even make a move when they realize that they have been detected. Some battles should be avoided as much as possible. This way, we can preserve as much of our strength as possible. After all, our mission is to reach where we need to go first, not to destroy as many enemies as possible along the way." After a pause, he looked at Nangong Kaishu and said, "Even more importantly, people will die in every battle, especially when many cultivators face an army." Nangong Kaishu took a deep breath. She unconsciously turned to look at the soldiers behind her. She completely understood Ding Ning's efforts in recent days. She also felt that she had learned many things from Ding Ning's few words. Even deliberately leaving clues to warn them could not scare them away, and only cause some of them to have differences. There are only two possibilities. One is that they received a death order and cannot return. The other is that they're only here to test the strength of this army, or to use up some power. There are true experts behind them who have not acted. Ding Ning slowly finished speaking and then looked seriously at Guofeng. Regardless of which possibility, I want to have complete control of this army. Guofeng laughed and said coldly, "Since you know this is related to the lives of my brothers, and still dare to make such a request, then I will give this army to you now. I have stayed here for so long to tell them that we are prepared. If they are still here, then there will be unavoidable battle." Ding Ning bowed his head slightly. He sensed a familiar feeling, but he did not like this feeling. Multiple orders were given. The army that had been waiting silently for a long time started to move. Because these orders were strange, it was slightly chaotic. But Ding Ning did not need to rush for time. So he waited until the army calmed down again before he indicated for them to continue forward. Multiple messengers came to his side under Guofeng's signal to ensure that his orders could be given immediately. There was still an hour until dusk. The weather was slightly cold, but the wind blowing as the army moved, and they bathed in the sunlight. It was very comfortable. This area was only a few border cities away from Yin Mountain. There were no commonly used roads in the wilderness. The chariots crushed the grass. The armor of the soldiers rubbed against the grass and gave off strange rustling sounds. Ding Ning was in the second row of chariots at the front. He frowned as he looked around. He seemed to be listening to the noise in the wind. Suddenly, he raised his hand. The flesh at the edges of his fingers was reflected red in the sunlight. "Stop! Ready!" The messengers and all the soldiers in this army were familiar with this hand gesture. But in order to prevent people from not being able to react, multiple messengers immediately shouted. When everyone suddenly stopped in their tracks and the world stilled, a noise appeared clearly in the grass and reached everyone's ears. Some grasses and leaves flew out along with the sharp sword power. Above a yellow airwave, countless pieces of grasses and leaves rose into the air, looking like a yellow-bodied flood dragon with yellow-green scales, dashing rapidly through the grasses and leaves. Flying sword. All the soldiers who could not understand Ding Ning's previous actions and orders reacted. Below the grass, and even in the cracks of the earth, there were many pairs of eyes looking at this army. When they saw the sword light, their eyes were filled with anger. The anger of these cultivators came from their companions attacking first. But they could not deny that since they had already attacked, and when the army was distracted for a moment, and most people were attracted by the flying sword, this was the best chance to attack. In that instant, the sound of flowing water could be heard from below the grass. Looking at the flying sword, many soldiers were shocked and furious. But Ding Ning's expression did not change. Heavy crossbow, nether fire, moonblade. He only calmly shouted out 3 names in a very hurried tone. At the same time, the messengers next to him made 3 hand gestures. In this moment, the air behind the army was torn to pieces by the metal light and the chaotic flows of primal energies of the universe. Hundreds of flowing metal lights fell down like meteors. After the meteor, there were dozens of crescent moons that seemed extremely heavy. These crescent moons were more than a dozen feet long. The moment they fell to the ground with terrifying humming sounds, they exploded along the seal lines into more 2-foot-long metal blades. What appeared in the air at the end were hundreds of flowing green flames. When these flames fell, they caused the grass in the air and the withered grass on the ground to burn. It was a sea of fire. The area between 50 and 100 paces behind the Imperial Guard army was a sea of fire. When the first batch of heavy crossbow bolts as thick as a child's arm howled from the ballistae, the grass 50 paces behind the army boiled and gave off furious shouts. For cultivators charged out of the ground, sword lights dancing around them, and deflected the falling heavy crossbow bolts. But in the next moment, the bodies of these 4 cultivators were torn open by the spinning, shattering moon blades. As they screamed, the dark green flames fell, piercing through their bodies as they fled in all directions. Looking at this scene, looking at the 4 cultivators whose bodies were torn apart in the flowing fire, all of these soldiers were shocked to a point where they couldn't be any more shocked. "Why is it like this?" A cultivator who appeared at the front of the army shouted in confusion. He saw the flying sword that was furiously flying towards Ding Ning on the chariot suddenly change direction and fall to Ding Ning's left. A clear and crisp sound rang out. A flying sword flashing with blue light flew into the air. This previously silent flying sword was forcibly pulled out of the grass, pulled out by that previously incomparably berserk flying sword. Chapter 435. Release. A clear female voice rang out. The one who spoke was Nangon Kaishu. Her expression was austere, but because this was the first time she had faced a true battle formation and given such an order, her sharp voice trembled slightly. However, the dozens of soldiers who had already received the order to gather behind her did not hesitate at all. These soldiers were all old soldiers, and their mission in the army had always been to deal with the flying swords of cultivators. The flying swords of cultivators were the fastest weapons to take lives on the battlefield. So while these soldiers were not cultivators, they had experienced many fierce battles, and their wills were like steel. They had filtered out all noise on the battlefield, including any noise from Nangon Kaishu's voice. The moment the military order sounded, these soldiers expressionlessly raised their crossbows and quickly pulled the triggers. Dozens of strange howls sounded in the air at the same time. This kind of sound was not unfamiliar to cultivators who had experienced battle. Dozens of copper flowers bloomed in the air. They were all metal nets with heavy objects on the edges. The slightly green flying sword that had just been flicked up was like a fish that had fallen into a net. It struggled with all its might, but the more it struggled, the more tangled the net became. In the end, it was bound into a ball, turning into a copper-colored metal ball that smashed into the ground. This was the sword-binding net of the Qin dynasty. The copper nets with large amounts of lead could bind flying swords, and at the same time, cut off the flow of primal energies of the universe and the flow of physical energy. But if just now was not a fleeting opportunity, if this flying sword had not been flicked up by another flying sword, how could the sword-binding net easily hit and bind this flying sword? Waves of uncontrollable cheers and roars rang out from the army. These soldiers naturally understood the price they had to pay to deal with a cultivator. But in this moment, 3 of the other side's cultivators were killed, a flying sword tied up. This was equivalent to the powerful swordsman losing an arm. All of this came from the military orders Ding Ning had given before the army continued to march. Deceptive sword. Only now did some of the cultivators who continued to appear in the grass react. The wild flying sword that had appeared first was not from their side, but Ding Ning's own flying sword. Pew! A mouthful of blood sprayed out of the throat of a yellow-robed cultivator standing in the grass. That flying sword that had just raised the slightly green flying sword was clearly in the same area, but it managed to escape the binding of those sword nets. At this time, it silently passed through the underbrush, directly piercing the throat of the cultivator who had just lost his flying sword. The white sword light appeared for a moment behind the cultivator and then disappeared to an unknown place. The threat of this flying sword and the speed at which the army suddenly reaped the lives of cultivators caused this part of the world to pause. There were 7 cultivators who appeared from the grass. At this time, only 3 were still in the grass. No new orders were issued, but at this time, all the soldiers were in awe of the power Ding Ning had shown through his military orders. So this army showed a presence as cold as a mountain. This presence caused the 3 cultivators standing in the grass to appear even colder. One of the cultivators took a step forward. No one moved, but he moved. He naturally attracted everyone's attention. This was a middle-aged man with white hair at his temples. Ding Ning looked calmly at him. This middle-aged man bowed to Ding Ning from a distance and then asked, "Using deceptive swords to lure us out is a matter of strategy. But why are you so sure that our people will appear behind your army? Is there meaning in this?" Ding Ning looked at the middle-aged man and said with slight disdain, "Even if I answer your question, you will leave?" The middle-aged man was silent for a moment and said, "No one wants to die. Maybe we have other choices." Ding Ning looked at the middle-aged man and suddenly laughed. He said, "Those who can see may have other thoughts, but those who cannot see will not change their minds and still want me to die. So unless those who cannot see die." Ding Ning's words were difficult for most soldiers to understand, But the middle-aged man and the other cultivators knew the meaning in his words. The middle-aged man looked at him and smiled bitterly. He said, "Is there no compromise?" Ding Ning looked at him and the other two cultivators and said, "Otherwise, how can I trust you?" The middle-aged man bowed his head slightly. He did not seem to respond, but the moment he bowed his head, two furious shouts sounded from the desolate grass. Two silhouettes rushed out from under the soil. The grass and soil above were washed into a thick fog. Below the two silhouettes, there was a faint sword light flashing with a faint light. Looking at the sword light chasing the two figures, Ding Ning suddenly raised his arm. His palm straightened as he made a killing gesture. Seeing where Ding Ning's gesture landed, not just the messengers around him, but even Guofeng and Nangong Saishu's eyes were filled with shock. But a military order was a military order. The messengers looked at Ding Ning's determined gesture and waved their flags at the same time. Wind! Wind! The cold and murderous army erupted like a volcano and gave off a tsunami-like sound. All the crossbow chariots and seal weapons exploded at this moment. The heavy metal swept up like the wind, covering the sky, and then fell down like a mountain. The middle-aged man looked up, his face pale. These metal weapons that covered the sky were not falling towards the two cultivators, but him and the other two cultivators. The two cultivators behind him gave off howls and rushed to the middle-aged man's side. Two sword lights were like shields, trying to protect the middle-aged man. But the middle-aged man knew he could not change the final result. The flying sword that had been chasing the two cultivators who had come out of the ground was quickly pulled back towards him. At the same time, he shook his head and said, "If you can leave, leave quickly." Bam! Heavy hammering sounds sounded in the world. When the heavy objects flying in the sky hit the ground at the same time, the ground rippled like waves. The two cultivators around him gave off sorrowful cries. They had no intentions of fleeing. Their sword-wielding arms were bloody and could not be raised. What saddened the two of them the most was that several flying swords had already flown out from the army in front of them. But among those flying swords, the first flying sword was not among them. The first flying sword with flowers blooming had appeared in front of the middle-aged man's retracted flying sword. Chapter 436. The light in the middle-aged man's eyes flashed violently. His flying sword turned back and then started to accelerate. With a hint of madness, it pointed towards Ding Ning, who was 60 to 70 feet away. When it was several dozen zhang away from his own body, this thin, earthen yellow small sword accelerated to the extreme. A light pop noise sounded in the surroundings, and then a sonic boom that could be seen with the naked eye erupted. At the same time, the middle-aged man channeled all his power into this flying sword. This flying sword left his control. It was no longer a flying sword, but an arrow faster than the speed of sound. No one had expected Ding Ning's choice. When this flying sword started to madly accelerate, Ding Ning took a step back. He did not retreat normally, but his right foot stepped hard on the back of the chariot. The heavy chariot tilted up. When the flying sword turned into a terrifying arrow, the chariot with its front tilted up had already turned into a huge shield, blocking in front of him. Bam! Heavy hammering sounded again in the world. The bottom of the heavy bronze chariot protruded towards Ding Ning's body and towards Ding Ning, forming a dome. At the same time, a wave of energy exploded from this protruding metal surface. The heavy formation chariot shook countless times in that instant. On the other side, the thin yellow sword was like an icicle that had collided with a thick wall. It instantly shattered into countless small pieces, turning into metal rays that shot backwards in all directions under the sunlight. Wind! Wind! The army behind Ding Ning roared again, like a tsunami. The sound of reloaded heavy crossbows sounded again. A wave of metal appeared in the sky above. The middle-aged man coughed up blood. His body turned gray under the reflection of the metal in the sky. "Go!" he shouted again, not to the two attendants next to him, but to the two cultivators who had charged out of the ground. Pew! 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 The sound of sharp metal piercing flesh sounded. Mists of blood gushed out from the middle-aged man and his two attendants' bodies. In a breath's time, this scene disappeared from everyone's sight. The three of them were no longer in human form. Only the sound of metal colliding and the splashing of flesh and blood could be heard. The two cultivators who had charged out of the ground did not listen to the middle-aged man's last order. These two cultivators howled like wild beasts. They left afterimages in the grass as they charged madly towards the Qin dynasty army. No one gave a military order. Behind the two cultivators, there were many rapid flows of energy that spun back. At the center of the flows were sword lights. These sword lights were faster than the figures of the two cultivators, so they easily caught up to the two cultivators. Waves of blood appeared on the bodies of the two cultivators. The sword lights entered and exited their bodies. Their bodies disintegrated as they flew and hit the ground. This was a bloody and cruel scene. Nangang Kaishu felt like vomiting, but she forced herself to watch. She knew she had to get used to a scene like this, because she would face more scenes like this in the future. Only by getting used to it would she not be affected by her emotions when facing a battle like this in the future and make mistakes in judgment. Boom! When the two cultivators' limbs fell to the ground, the heavy chariot that had been lifted in the air finally fell back to the ground. Because no one was certain if there were other cultivators on the plains, no one cheered. But even the generals controlling the flying swords couldn't help but show indescribable joy in their eyes. No one liked to see blood, especially the people around them. Everyone knew what kind of price an army would pay if they encountered an ambush from these cultivators. But now, the other side had lost 7 cultivators, and the army they led had not lost a single soldier. Why? Nangang Kaishu looked at the limbs that were no longer rolling in the grass. She struggled to breathe and turned to ask Ding Ning. He had brought Nangang Kaishu with him, so she could learn many things about marching and fighting. So Ding Ning looked back at her and said, 500 feet behind our army is an area that the cultivators in our army cannot sense clearly. Since these cultivators decided to attack here, there will definitely be cultivators hiding behind our army and attacking from the rear. This will cause the greatest chaos. What if those cultivators are not there? Nangang Kaishu thought and asked with a frown. Then won't our best seal weapons all be lost? Ding Ning glanced at her and said seriously, you have to understand, marching to war and fighting cultivators are the same. There is nothing 100% certain. You only pursue the greatest probability of success. If not one of these people is in the rear, then the strongest attack of our army will be wasted and useless. But the greatest possibility is in order to avoid being detected by the cultivators in our army, the strongest and most skilled in concealment will circle to the back of the army and attack at any time. This is also their strongest power. Nangang Kaishu nodded. She thought for a moment, organized her thoughts, and then asked, in the end, in the view of most of us, that middle-aged swordsman had nowhere else to go. After failing the assassination and not being able to report back, he wanted to join us. In that moment, when he attacked and forced out the 2 hidden cultivators, he was murderous. In my view, there were no flaws. Why did you order to attack them? On the battlefield, any judgment cannot be based on what we see. What we see on the surface is usually false. Ding Ning said slowly and patiently. Previously, when these cultivators discovered that we had detected their tracks, they had differences. But in the end, these cultivators still chose to fight here. Especially after I waited for a long time and told them that I knew they would start a battle here. They still did not give up. This means that there is a powerful commander among them. This powerful commander does not just need to have iron methods and determination, but also the cultivation to suppress all of them. Just now, based on the cultivation these people have shown, that middle-aged man is the strongest. So that middle-aged man is the commander who forced the other cultivators to fight here. After a pause, Ding Ning looked at Nangang Kaishu, whose face was slowly stiffening. He said calmly, so all of his efforts, even sacrificing those 2 cultivators, was to complete his mission in the end, to get close to me and kill me. Nangang Kaishu struggled to swallow. She looked deeply at Ding Ning. She could not understand how this youth who came from a wine shop could have such a brain and such astounding insight. Then how did you discover that they had differences? Nangong Kaishu asked a question that puzzled Guofeng and the other generals. If a cultivator's emotions are problematic, then their actions will inadvertently be different from usual. For example, the fluctuations of their presence, the path they're used to traveling and the distance they maintain, the traces they would not normally leave behind on their path, many things like this. Sometimes these negative emotions will be vented on things along the way, like snakes and insects. You even noticed this? Do you remember the falcon I killed with my flying sword 2 nights ago? Related to this? That falcon is holding a bamboo rat whose head has been chopped off. Ding Ning looked at the disbelieving Nangong Kaishu and said coolly, "First, bamboo rats are cute and harmless. They're also very afraid of people. When they detect people, they will flee. They are not a threat like poisonous snakes and do not need to be killed with a sword. The meat of bamboo rats tastes good, but they do not eat after killing them. This means that this cultivator used his sword because his emotions were not right." Nangong Kaishu looked dazedly at Ding Ning. "How did you notice these details? Look at the people behind you." Ding Ning did not turn his head and said softly to Nangong Kaishu, "You only have to think that the lives of these people are in your hands. If you are not careful, these people may become corpses. You will naturally be more careful." Nangong Kaishu instinctively turned her head. She looked at the soldiers standing behind her and inexplicably trembled. Last question. Nangong Kaishu was silent for a long time before she looked up and said, "His sword was very fast in the end, but you clearly predicted it. So you had time to use the chariot to block it. How did you predict it? Also, since you predicted it, why did you not dodge directly, but use the method of destroying a chariot to block it?" "Because I gave him a chance to fight with my flying sword." Ding Ning looked at Nangong Kaishu, and his expression grew grave. He said softly, "I am seriously injured and have not recovered. If he chose to fight with my flying sword in the end, he would at least worsen my injuries. But he chose such a sword. Facing the entire army, there was no way he could kill me with a single strike. This means that he wants to test if there are any hidden powerful cultivators in the army. It's just that this kind of test is meaningless to him because he's going to die soon. So he's just trying it out for others to see, for example, a stronger assassin." Nangong Kaishu thought this through, and her expression grew ugly. As to why he destroyed a chariot, Ding Ning turned to look at her and said, "This is a similar problem to just now. A very simple problem. His sword is very fast and strong. If I just dodge..." When he said this, Nangong Kaishu completely understood. There were many soldiers behind Ding Ning. She temporarily had no more problems. But before Ding Ning had the army continue to advance, he looked at her and said seriously, "Do not spend your energy on thinking about the origins of these people. In a battle where you cannot leave, a general only needs to think about what the army will encounter along the way. What you need to deal with is always the enemy you are about to encounter, and not the enemy far away. Why do you seem to be focused on nurturing her into a general?" When Ding Ning returned to Zhang Sun Qinchua's carriage, Zhang Sun Qinchua's cool voice sounded in his ears. "Because she is very suited to be a general, and her life seems to be arranged to be a general," Ding Ning said softly and slowly. "Also, this is just the immediate matter. There will be many battles to fight in the future." Chapter 437. The Imperial Guard Army was stationed in the center of the grasslands. Behind the grasslands were 12 border cities of the Qin dynasty. Compared to the vastness of the Yin Mountain, these 12 border cities were so minuscule they were like 12 pearls scattered on the grasslands. The border city closest to the grasslands and furthest from the Yin Mountain was called Upper Prison City. This city had originally been the outermost border city of the Qin dynasty. In the past, it had been built by the criminals sent here. At sunrise, a tall man appeared on the gate tower of Upper Prison City. He was wearing bronze armor, but there were no patterns on it because the armor was covered with all kinds of sword marks. The density of these deep and shallow sword marks, old and new, were like dandelion flowers blooming on the surface of the armor. Especially under the sunlight, some of the metal sections flashed with golden light like there were bolts of cold lightning swimming inside. Some of the sword marks were several inches deep, but they still did not penetrate. This meant that the armor was astoundingly thick. The most important thing was that these sword marks were too dense. Under the pressure of these sword marks, the metal of the armor itself seemed to have changed. Some crystallized light even appeared in the metal. This tall man had a large face and looked rougher than the men of Guangzhou. He carried 2 long blades on his back and not a sword. The scabbards were leather and simply sewn. Even the fur on them had not been removed. They looked like wolf skin from the grasslands. The hilts were light yellow with some purple red. They did not look like metal, but some kind of jade. This man's eyes were like gemstones, flashing with a natural blue light, as pure as the sky above the grasslands. He gazed at the grasslands in front of him and knew that the Imperial Guard army would not reach the border city until this afternoon. He had come here because of the youth in the Imperial Guard army, but he knew his battle would end before the youth arrived. A gust of morning wind blew. This wind came from the Yin Mountain, carrying coldness, and added some murderous intent. The wind carried the scent of cow and sheep dung from the distance. The withered and yellow grass surged like waves in the ocean. The man standing on top of the city gate slightly narrowed his eyes. A wisp of green appeared between the withered and yellow leaves. Xiao Sharon, dressed in the indigo robes of Min Mountain Sword Sect, stepped on the dry grass and slowly walked along the path formed by galloping horses towards the city gates. In the center of Upper Lao City, there was a large open space. This open space was originally used for the execution of criminals, but at this moment, it was densely packed with kneeling people, most of them women and children. There was only a very handsome man standing there. This man seemed to be a little afraid of the cold. He was wearing a white fox fur coat, but this coat was covered in dust. Even the surging Zhen Yuan couldn't wash away the yellowness of the long journey. There was a long sword at his waist. The hilt was inlaid with many luxurious gems. These gems were carved in the shape of skulls. This handsome man slowly raised his head in the wind that carried the smell of cow and sheep dung. Then, he casually glanced at the women and children kneeling in front of him. At this time, at the other end of the square, a man with an extremely ordinary face appeared. Even if he stood in the crowd, he would be easily forgotten. However, this man was also wearing a jade-green robe. The man in the white fox fur coat smiled faintly and said, "Everyone says that the butcher treats human lives as grass. I had not expected this move to be effective against you. Who can truly treat human lives as grass?" Gungren looked at this man and said emotionlessly, "But you, Yelut Songlong, Donghu's third crown prince, a person of importance to all of Wuji. You risk appearing here. Do you treat other people's lives as grass, or your own lives as grass?" Yelut Songlong put away his smile and showed a hint of coldness. "I am the most important person in the Wuji army. I naturally have to appear in the most important place. Is there anything more important than stopping the people of Min Mountain Sword Sect from entering the battlefield?" After a pause, he looked at Gung Run and laughed in self-mockery. Then he said, "If I can prevent the people of Min Mountain Sword Sect from appearing on the battlefield, so what if I die here?" Gung Run looked at him and said something only the two of them could understand. "If you are determined to do this, we may become the prey of others, and all of us will die here. So I did not kill these people because I want to leave behind some conditions to discuss with you. You just want to escort that disciple who is extremely important to Min Mountain Sword Sect to Donghu. I can let him safely reach Donghu." Yelut Songlong smiled faintly. "We can even go with you to the Donghu border to take a look. But the condition is that we must leave together. The condition is that no cultivator of Min Mountain Sword Sect will enter Wuji again." Gung Rin thought for a moment and said, "We do not want to enter Wuji." Yelut Songlong took a deep breath and said, "I understand how Min Mountain Sword Sect feels. So I feel that it is possible to talk with you." Gung Rin looked into his eyes and said, "Without our protection, he will be in danger in Donghu." Yelut Songlong also looked into his eyes and said, "Ling Shan and I are here. If we fight to the death today, he will be in more danger, and even Min Mountain Sword Sect will be in danger." After a pause, Yelut Songlong slowly said, "Also, If he goes to Donghu, I can guarantee that no one in Wuji will go against him. Gung Rin slowly said, You are so assured that he will be at the Donghu border. That is a matter of Donghu and Chu. Yelu Songlong said with slight disdain. If even a Realm 5 cultivator who has lost the protection of Min Mountain Sword Sect can change everything there, then Donghu and Chu cannot affect our war against the Qin dynasty. Gungren thought. Yelu Songlong glanced at him and said, You should not have much time to make a decision, because I had not expected you to value this youth so much that even Xiao Sharon has come. Gungren knew what he meant. In a few dozen breaths, either the strongest Wuji general on the city wall would kill Xiao Sharon, or Xiao Sharon would kill him. But the survivors of either side would not have an easy time. He did not hesitate and nodded simply. He said, Come with us to Donghu, and then return. Yelu Songlong smiled slightly. He gave a clear howl. At this time, Xiao Sharon was in front of the city gates. The armored man on the city gates gripped his blade. But when he heard the clear howl, he shook his head with regret and said to Xiao Sharon, We cannot fight. Xiao Sharon's figure disappeared among the yellow leaves. The divine general-like man on the city gate tower also disappeared from the city gate tower. Yelu Songlong and Gung Rin also disappeared from the city. Those kneeling women and children started to sob loudly. There was not even a hawk or vulture in the sky. Looking down from the sky, there was a circle of short black and red walls inside the city walls. The black were the bodies of the Qin soldiers in black armor, and the bodies of the black vultures that usually flew in the sky. The red was the blood that had flowed out and had not completely dried. Other than these women and children, there were no other survivors in this city. Chapter 438. These corpses must be disposed of immediately. Ding Ning said slowly as he stood on the city gates and looked at the black and red walls. How? Nangong Kaishu could not help but shout in anger. Her body trembled violently. She did not want to vent her emotions on Ding Ning, but she could not imagine how Ding Ning could remain so calm after seeing such a scene. Your anger and hatred right now surpass your sorrow. Ding Ning turned to look at Nangong Kaishu, his expression growing cold. Right now, other people have massacred a city of the Qin dynasty. At least, they have left behind the women and children. But the Qin dynasty's army has not only massacred other people's cities. This is war. Anger and hatred towards an enemy you have missed will only cause you to act impulsively and cause greater mistakes. There is no meaning. No meaning? Nangong Saishu's face grew unusually pale. She bit her lips and squeezed out. You want me to not hate the enemy who massacred this city? Ding Ning was silent for a moment and said, You have to understand, the ones who can cause war are not the generals who lead the army, but the few people with the highest status in the world. If we get to the bottom of this, who caused this? Nangong Saishu's breathing stopped. She felt that she could not completely agree with Ding Ning's words, but she did not know how to argue. Hatred cannot solve the problem. Just now you have heard the accounts of some of the women. The other is using such a method to force Min Mountain Sword Sect to not interfere in Wuji's war. This is understandable. The Qin dynasty's army has entered other people's land. What does this mean? A hint of bitterness appeared at the corners of Ding Ning's mouth. I only know that if we do not deal with these corpses now, I fear it will cause many serious diseases. Many of these women and children will die. Facing coldly, this is the problem a successful general needs to consider. Nangong Kaishu smiled sadly. Not so. Ding Ning shook his head, always thinking for the people who are still alive. This is the problem a general needs to consider. Black smoke ignited. The Imperial Guard army began to burn all the corpses in the border city. This battle won't be easy. Ding Ning did not look at the burning fire and the ashes of the corpses. He looked coldly at Yin Mountain not far away and said slowly, Not us. Nangong Kaishu turned to look at him in shock. Ding Ning said slowly, Both the guards in the city and the reinforcements coming from outside the city died near the city walls. There are not many cultivators in Wuji who can massacre a city by themselves. The only one who can kill all the guards along the way so quickly should be Yelu Songlong. nicknamed the Gray Wolf of the Grasslands. He is the Grand Marshal of Wuji. Ding Ning paused and unconsciously clenched his fists. Then he said, "Even the Grand Marshal risked his life to come here. This means that they will not fight according to our expectations. So they may not do as I imagine, and use delaying tactics until after the snow." Nangong Kaishu started to understand what he meant. Her face that had just recovered some color turned white again. "You mean they may use a surprise attack? Or a head-on attack?" Ding Ning nodded. Nangong Kaishu felt cold all over. She struggled to speak. "Then how can we pass the news through Een Mountain as quickly as possible?" "It is useless." Ding Ning shook his head. "Even Yelu Tsanglong is here. Even if we can send the news to the front lines, it is too late. Also, what status do those generals have? Will they easily listen to our suggestions? Yelu Tsanglong and the others, maybe they want to use a great victory to give Donghu and the Chu dynasty confidence, no matter how great the price they will pay. As long as this price can stop the Qin dynasty at Een Mountain and not turn them into an existence like the Yuezhi. No one was a god and could not predict everything. Ding Ning's judgment of Wuji had been wrong before he left, but at least his judgment was very accurate now. The autumn of the 12th year of Yuanwu of the Qin dynasty. Not long after Ding Ning's Imperial Guard army arrived, Wuji gathered more than 300,000 people at a terrifying speed and split into 3 groups to attack the Qin dynasty army that had crossed the border. Wuji had been nomadic since ancient times. To the Qin people in Guangzhou, the Wuji people were grassland barbarians. These grassland barbarians were adept at capturing and taming wild horses. Their horsemanship was superb, and they came and went like the wind. Speed and archery were their greatest strengths, and what gave the great Qin army the most headache was the vast grassland behind them. These grasslands were wilderness to the Qin dynasty army, but to them, they were cities. The advantages of the Qin dynasty army were sealed chariots and battle formations. They had many cultivators, and their ability to advance and fight was unparalleled in the world. Yet to everyone's surprise, the Wuji army did not use guerrilla tactics and directly formed an army to fight the Qin dynasty's border army head-on. The Wuji army, mainly cavalry, should not be able to fight the Qin dynasty's army. Yet because they had not expected the Qin dynasty army to encounter such a battle when they did not have enough soldiers at the border. Under the attack of the Wuji army, many times their own, the Qin dynasty army was defeated and suffered great losses. After paying the price of more than 70,000 lives, Wuji killed more than 60,000 of the Qin dynasty's border army and took almost all the food and supplies of the Qin dynasty's vanguard. They continued to pursue the remnants of the Qin dynasty's border army. This kind of victory was astounding. Even when the Qin dynasty had fought against the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, they had not paid such a great price. Back then, the Qin army and the other 3 dynasties had a casualty ratio of 1 to 3. In other words, to kill 1 Qin soldier, they had to pay the price of at least 3 soldiers from other dynasties. The Wuji army's advantage was speed. When the pursuit started, it meant that the Qin army would suffer greater casualties. This may be the greatest defeat in the history of the Qin army. What changed the fate of this battle slightly was the first batch of reinforcements, especially the large number of cultivators who came from Chongling to the Een Mountain. Faster than horse hooves were the swords of the cultivators. The addition of large numbers of cultivators caused the Wuji cavalry to suffer astounding losses. But as many cultivators were killed by the human wave tactic or the Wuji cultivators, the situation of the battle was unusually disadvantageous for the Qin dynasty. While it was officially autumn, the temperature in the north outside the pass was extremely cold. When food was short for some armies, especially those that had been scattered, the situation was even worse. At a low point in the meadow, some trees had lost their yellow leaves. Many wounded Qin soldiers were lying on the long grass that had been cut into carpets. A round-faced young woman with a sword was discussing military matters with several generals with a stern expression. War was the easiest. At this moment, a shrill warning whistle suddenly sounded from the meadow. But after a breath, the whistle turned into the sound of a bamboo flute. This meant that it was not the enemy that had come, but one of their own. A youth appeared in the round-faced young woman's sight. His attire was similar to ordinary Wuji soldiers. He seemed to be unusually afraid of the cold, and wore an unusually thick and rough fur robe. But his face did not have the characteristics of a Wuji person. Even more importantly, his left hand was slightly outstretched. A pale white jade token hung from his fingertip with a simple Li character engraved on it. This Li character was enough for the round-faced young woman and the generals to immediately think that he could only be the exiled son of the Li Marquisate establishment who had just returned to the pass, Li Shixing. Do not think about attacking that little barbican 10 miles away. Glancing at the round-faced young woman and the generals around her, Li Shixing said directly, "That is a trap. At least 2 Qin armies like you have been killed there." A few Qin captains exchanged glances, their eyes filled with shock and anger. Remnant troops like them, when pursued by the Wuji army, could only choose to hide or circle around. It would take a long time to retreat to the border city of the Yin Mountain, yet the food they brought could only last for a few days. In their view, the food in the Wuji barbican was the key to whether they could leave this place alive. "How many people do you have?" Li Shixing did not care about the expressions of these generals. He rarely cared about other people's expressions in Chongling. He asked coldly, "Including the wounded, 357 people, 321 people who can fight." The round-faced young woman was the calmest at this time. After Li Shixing asked, she answered without hesitation, "Too few." Li Shixing was silent for a long time and said, "Wuji has a cavalry of about 3,000 people. They will surround this place at night." Unless it was an army made entirely of cultivators, the Qin army could not win against the Wuji cavalry when the ratio was more than 1-4. Also, this was just the remnants of the Qin army. Without powerful military equipment, ordinary swordsmen would be shot to death by the archers on horseback before they could get close. There is only one choice now. Li Shixing still did not care about the expressions of these generals and said, "Have all the wounded stay here, and the rest leave as soon as possible." One of the generals in his 40s had a cold gaze. He looked at Li Shixing and slowly said, "This may be the best choice and the most rational choice, but it is not our best choice." Li Shixing did not argue. He just bowed deeply to this general. Because this general's choice was worthy of his respect, he turned around after bowing. Since this general had chosen to die in battle here, it was not worth it for him to stay here and die with these people. "Wait." But the moment he turned around, the round-faced young woman's voice sounded. There must be another choice and method. Li Shixing did not look back. He looked coldly at the grass in the distance that was taller than a person. He thought that after the sky darkened, the enemy cavalry would charge out at any time. "What choice and method?" he asked. "Since you know that the cavalry will come, then maybe we can lure them away." The round-faced young woman heard his cold voice and said, "Us?" Li Shixing sneered mercilessly. "With just us? I am a cultivator of Treasure Light Temple." The round-faced young woman was not angry because of this and stated the truth seriously. "I am the only disciple of Treasure Light Temple who received all the teachings." Chapter 439. Not long ago, when you just arrived at Yin Mountain, I heard about the matter of Treasure Light Temple. Li Shixing was silent for a moment and looked at the round-faced young woman. "So you are the female disciple of Treasure Light Temple called Hu Jingjing?" The round-faced young woman nodded and said, "I am Hu Jingjing." Li Shixing turned around and looked at the young woman called Hu Jingjing. He said, "You and all the cultivators of Treasure Light Temple were forced to come here. Do you not hate? You should know that even if you have some unique methods of your sect, it is not much different from sending us to our deaths to lure away the cavalry." "What is the difference?" Hu Jingjing looked at him and frowned. "I also heard about you. You were also forced to come here." Li Shixing shook his head. "It is still different. I have been outside the pass for many years and am used to everything here. But you have just arrived. Also, I was not forced here by the army." Hu Jingjing also shook her head. "There is still no difference, especially when you see with your own eyes that many people die in front of you every day. They're just carrying out military orders for the Qin dynasty. If there is hate, than it is in the future. Right now, I am one of them. Li Shixing glanced at her. Before he had time to speak, Hu Jingjing already turned to look at where the wounded were lying. She said slowly and quietly, "You should also understand that cultivators like us are the first to be noticed in battle. Of the people lying there, many were injured because of me. If I cannot do it, if there is a situation where two people cannot escape, but I alone can, I will escape." Li Shixing was silent for a long moment, and then said to Hu Jingjing, "If you are sure you want to try to lure away the cavalry." Li Shixing said 3 ifs, causing the words to sound awkward. But Hu Jingjing understood his meaning. She bowed seriously to Li Shixing again. "Thank you." The reason she thanked him was because Li Shixing originally did not have to do such a dangerous thing. But now, he had to fight with her. "Follow me." Li Shixing turned coldly. For him, this was his own choice. Hu Jingjing silently followed behind Li Shixing. The two of them walked quickly and soon disappeared from the sight of the soldiers in the meadow. Looking at the direction where this round-faced girl, who had left a deep impression on all of them, disappeared, led by the 3 generals, all of the soldiers saluted in an exceptionally solemn and cold manner. The grassland outside Een Mountain was desolate to begin with. Furthermore, it was not close to any habitation. Hu Jingjing followed behind Li Shixing. The more they walked, the quieter it became. She felt like she was gradually being abandoned by the world and swallowed up by the weeds. She looked at the back of this person who was not much older than her and could only be considered a youth at most. Her eyes were filled with curiosity. She could not imagine how such a person could get used to walking alone in the wilderness. "If I can't leave, and you can leave, then you can leave alone." The ruler of this area is not the Qin or the Wuji, but the wolf pack. They can follow the presence of blood. The Wuji cavalry followed the tracks left behind by the wolf pack. Lone cultivators, especially those who are injured and cannot fight for long, when encountering large numbers of wolves, their only chance of survival is to quickly find a large water source nearby. The youth's voice suddenly sounded and reached her ears. She stilled slightly and said, "Why?" "Because the large water sources in the wilderness are also the drinking places of many other beasts. The wolf packs will be very cautious in those places, and will only go there at special times. It is not a lone beast that the wolf pack cannot deal with, but a unique rule formed by nature. It was just like how a massive army could always kill a few lone cultivators, but the army would always maintain reverence towards cultivators. For us cultivators, those lone beasts are much easier to deal with than wolf packs." Hu Jingjing nodded. Li Shixing explained in detail, and she could not understand. "I am telling you this to remind you that this matter is very dangerous, more dangerous than anything I have done in the past. Both you and I may have to face a difficult escape." Li Shixing's cold voice sounded. "Since you told me from the start that you are the only direct disciple of Treasure Light Temple, then you definitely have comprehended the sword essence of the Treasure Light Sky Sword." Hu Jingjing said simply, "Yes." Li Shixing suddenly stopped and turned to look at Hu Jingjing. "With your cultivation, I fear you can only use the Treasure Light Sky Sword once." Hu Jingjing frowned slightly and said, "Yes. You feel there is hope because you feel that you may be able to use such a sword essence to help me assassinate the commander of the cavalry and cause chaos in the army. This way, we can delay the advance of the cavalry." Li Shixing looked at Hu Jingjing. "Do you think so?" Hu Jingjing's frown deepened. "That's what I think. You do not understand the Wuji army well enough." Li Shixing said gravely, "Wuji's population is many times smaller than the Qin dynasties. Gathering an army of 300,000 this time is unprecedented. An army of 3,000, if it corresponds to the structure of the Qin dynasty, is equivalent to our army of 20 to 30,000. The status of the commander of this army is similar to the status of the commander of the Qin dynasty. This kind of commander is usually a cultivator of equal cultivation to us, and there will be other cultivators protecting them. Therefore, it is almost impossible for such a sneak attack to kill the enemy's general." Hu Jingjing paled slightly. She thought for a breath and looked at Li Shixing. "My idea is not possible. But since you have accepted my suggestion, do you have other methods?" Li Shixing said in a cold voice. You cannot attack once. You have to attack 3 times, and each attack must appear different in cultivation. Hu Jingjing instinctively gritted her teeth, and then slowly relaxed. She said, "You have to make the other feel that there are at least 3 cultivators from Treasure Light Temple present?" Li Shixing glanced at her and nodded. He said, "These barbarians cannot know so much about Treasure Light Temple, but they can at least recognize what kind of sword essence this is. 1 or 2 cultivators cannot delay their steps. But if there are more than 3 cultivators like this, their choice will be different." Hu Jingjing naturally knew the price she would have to pay to use 3 attacks like this. She took a deep breath and said, "I will do my best." Li Shixing's eyes narrowed slightly. He said, "Not do your best, but you must do it." Hu Jingjing was not angry. She changed her words. "I will do it." Li Shixing did not look at her and turned to look in a certain direction. He sensed some of the meanings in the wind and said, "A cavalry army like this would normally have 3 groups of scouts, around 300 to 400 people. Only by killing these people quickly can we have a chance to get close to the main army. You cannot waste vital energy. So when I deal with these barbarians, you cannot use any vital energy." Hu Jingjing nodded without hesitation. "I will be your attendant." Li Shixing still did not turn to look at her. He continued to look in that direction and said, "This cavalry army will come faster than I imagined. Do not be my attendant. It is best if you move around the perimeter and do not kill. Do not kill all the barbarians. Have some of them leave behind to run back, so they will feel that there are many cultivators waiting for them on this path." Hearing these words, Hu Jingjing grew more silent, but inside, she felt more respect for this youth from the Li Marquisate establishment. The wind was constantly blowing at some of the canyons in Yin Mountain. The wind did not sound strong, but the coldness was like a knife stabbing into people's bodies. When the military intelligence from the front lines finally reached here, people's hearts became even colder. What to do? Guofeng looked at the latest urgent military intelligence that had been delivered to his hands. He had read it multiple times. Even though he had experienced many battles, his hands started to tremble uncontrollably. This would decide the life and death of tens of thousands of people. At the same time, it would decide the life and death of his 3,000 subordinates. After Yin Mountain was Guyu Pass. That was a pass of the Qin dynasty's border army. It was an important path in and out of the pass, and also a granary where the army stored food. At this time, a Wuji cavalry had taken a detour and was advancing towards this pass. This pass was where the remnants of the Qin army in the plains were retreating to rest and wait for reinforcements. If their retreat was cut off, the tens of thousands of Qin soldiers would likely all die in battle on the plains. That Wuji cavalry that had taken a detour was at least 10,000 strong in the military report, and there were less than 2,000 soldiers guarding Guyu Pass. The closest army to Guyu Pass that seemed to be able to arrive was the Imperial Guard army that was passing by. Military intelligence outside the pass did not travel as quickly as news from Chongling. Also, in the midst of a rout, it was hard to effectively give orders. At this time, the Qin army could only send out military intelligence along the way as quickly as possible. All urgent military intelligence needed the generals who received it to make their own judgments and decisions. Now, Guofeng only had 2 choices: send the 3,000 people to die together, or follow the original plan to reach the Donghu border as quickly as possible. Because he could not choose, he wanted to listen to Ding Ning's opinion. "We must try." Ding Ning did not have time to think and answered Guofeng. Nangong Kaishu was silent, but her sword slowly hummed. She had not expected such a change at all. Everything was different from what she had expected. Chapter 440. The Imperial Guard army continued to march. But as the war situation suddenly changed, the army's route suddenly changed and headed for Guyu Pass. Actually, even Guofeng himself feels that sending 3,000 Imperial Guard army soldiers over is just going to die with him. Ding Ning returned to Zhang Sun Qianxue's carriage. Zhang Sun Qianxue's cool voice reached his ears. "He actually wants to hear your refusal. You received orders to head for the Donghu border." Ding Ning had a rare expression of seriousness. If we cannot delay until the reinforcements arrive and hold Yin Mountain, we will not just lose control of the area around Yin Mountain. Even if we reach the Donghu border on time, I fear we will encounter worse than these defeated remnants. Zhang Sun Qinxue said coldly from inside the carriage. Even the driver could not hear her voice, but it sounded clearly in Ding Ning's ears. I have never liked and do not understand marching and fighting. I just want to know what you want to do. Play dead? Use the battle to erase our tracks. Have Zheng Xiu think we are dead, and then wait until you reach Realm 7 before returning to Chongling? You do not need to understand, and do not need to understand marching and fighting. Ding Ning said softly, I have something Zheng Xiu needs. So before she uses her last trump card, the chance of escaping her sight through the battle is very slim. Zhang Sun Qinxue said, Heaven replenishing divine art? Ding Ning said after a moment of silence, Heaven replenishing divine art. Zhang Sun Qinxue was silent for a moment. Her cool voice started to carry cold anger. Are we not being used by her now? Losing Yin Mountain may cause many more changes, and even cause the Qin dynasty to lose its strategic advantage over the three dynasties. Ding Ning looked up and said, The more unchanging Chongling is, the easier it is to set up in a Chongling with many changes. What if the revenge is not successful? Zhang Sun Qinxue said, Instead of giving her a stable world, a prosperous dynasty that has never been seen before. Ding Ning raised his head and looked at the desolate yellow grass in the distance. If I can't succeed in the end, then it's also good if there's a stable world. I'll just treat it as repaying the debts of many people. After all, no one in this world can live forever. No matter how great one's ambition is, in the end, it will still turn into soil and weeds. Zhang Sun Qinxue didn't say anything else. The light on the wilderness grew dimmer and dimmer. Dusk was approaching. Hundreds of Wuji soldiers appeared on the meadow hundreds of feet away from Li Shixing and Hu Jingjing. Different from the formation the Qin army usually used. Even though they were just scouts, these hundreds of cavalry formed a line, appearing almost at the same time like a dense forest. These tall horses and the riders on their saddles blocked the line of sight behind them. This made one feel that there was an unknown number of riders behind these people, giving off a strong sense of pressure. Unlike the Qin army who were skilled in using swords, these Wuji soldiers were skilled in using long blades, and many of them had dual blades. After fighting against the Qin army for so many years, these soldiers had long gotten used to a very frightening fighting style. When the enemy's sword stabbed into them, they would use the other saber to cut the enemy's saber. Their sword skills and agility, and even their weapons, could not compare to the Qin army. These people of the grassland spent more time training their brute strength and decisiveness in swinging their blades. Li Shixing was crouched in the grass. He slowly raised his head, but his body did not move at all. He had already told Hu Jingjing what he needed to tell her, so he didn't even look at her. Instead, he started to walk through the bushes like a wolf, along a path that had been opened long ago, his figure hidden in the grass until he disappeared from Hu Jingjing's sight. He did not make a sound. She carefully counted in her mind. When she counted to 50, Hu Jingjing started to retreat into the grass behind her. At the same time, she blew a bone whistle Li Shixing had given her. A howl that was almost identical to the howl of an alpha wolf suddenly rang out in the grassland. The cavalry that was as neat as a line moved at the same time. The hooves hit the soft ground and gave off a heart-palpitating sound. 3 riders charged out of the formation at lightning speed and immediately formed 3 straight waves in the sea of grass. The remaining close to 100 cavalry behind them slowly trotted forward in an orderly manner. Pew! 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 3 arrows tore through the air and accurately fell in the direction Hu Jingjing was retreating. Hu Jingjing stopped. The closest of the 3 arrows was just a few feet away from her. In this moment, a heavy thud. Among the close to 100 riders behind, one of them suddenly fell heavily into the wild grass, sending up a cloud of dust mixed with dried yellow debris. The warhorse neighed, unable to stand up. Then, one after another, Heavy muffled sounds and angry roars could be heard. The 10 or so riders beside this rider also fell to the ground in an extremely miserable manner, just like the one who fell first. Hu Jingjing's pupils contracted. She saw a scene that caused her to stop breathing. Even though she had experienced many fierce battles in the short span of a dozen days, and most of her sect brothers had died on the plains, she had never seen such a fast-killing speed, or rather, a speed that caused the cavalry to lose their horses. When the first horse fell, Li Shixing's figure appeared below the third horse that had fallen. He used a sword wrapped in cloth to stab upwards from below the horse's belly. At the same time he killed the rider, his left hand had already forcefully pulled out a few copper wires buried in the ground. As his body moved rapidly, these copper wires cut off the hooves of the horses along the way. The riders still on the horses shouted in shock. In a breath or two, these Wuji riders reacted, pulling out the long blades on the sides of the horses and stabbing them into the ground. Even though they could not know the direction of the copper wires buried in the ground, even if the horses under them had their hooves cut off, the long blades in the ground could wrap around the copper wires and prevent them from moving. In this moment, Li Shixing gave a low howl. He used all his power to throw something in front of him. What he threw out was just an ordinary iron hoop. The iron hoop was entwined with tough copper wires. But this ordinary metal hoop, under his full power, had astounding power. It immediately pulled at the blades of many riders and caused them to be unable to maintain their balance. Then Li Shixing started to kill. He started to kill at terrifying speed. The cloth wrapped around his sword was torn apart by a powerful force, revealing the pale, white blade inside. In Chongling, including the sword selection at Min Mountain Sword Sect, he had not used this sword. When his vital energy seemed to pour into the seal scripts of this sword without reservation, the pale, white blade of the sword gave off a long, fang-like light. Ah! Seeing this light in the dim light, one of the Wuji scouts shouted in shock. But before he could shout, this rider died. A slightly curved sword light rushed out from the sword, drawing a strange arc in the air, piercing through the rider's lower jaw, directly piercing through his head. Li Shixing's movements were extremely precise. At the same time he swung his sword to kill that person, he leaped up and kicked out two long swords at the same time. The two long swords flew out and directly cut two knights who didn't have time to dodge. At the same time, 5 crimson copper beads shot out of the 5 fingers of his left hand. The crimson copper beads exploded as they accelerated in the air, splitting along the seal scripts into countless small copper pieces that flew in the direction he had shot out. These copper pieces sputtered and stabbed into the flesh of these people. They were not fatal, but many people's faces seemed to be stung by flies, and many people's eyes were pierced. Just a few breaths ago, the scout army that had given off great pressure was in chaos. Li Shixing's body was like a wolf that had sped up to the limit as he moved through these people. But what made Hu Jingjing's scalp prickle was that he was extremely calm. The long blades that he pulled out and threw out with his left hand, or kicked out with his feet, all flew accurately towards the horses under him, or the unharmed riders. Hiss! Hu Jingjing finally recovered her breathing. In this short time, all the riders, other than the 3 lonely riders at the front, had fallen off their horses. They had either been killed, or their horses had fallen to the ground and could not get up. Hu Jingjing's shock turned into admiration. She knew that these Wuji soldiers could no longer pose a true threat to Li Shixing because the only cultivator among them had been killed by Li Shixing's full-power attack. Chapter 441. Bright red blood sprayed endlessly in the air. In the fast sprint and tight space, Li Shixing could not stop the blood from spraying on his robes. Many young talents in Chongling felt that Li Shixing was a monster after returning to Chongling because he still wore thick fur robes after returning to Chongling. Yet those young talents did not know that this was an instinct formed in blood. When Chongling just entered autumn, it was winter outside the pass. In another half a month, it would be the first snowfall of the past. In a year, this place would be very cold for more than half of the year. Even more importantly, when blood soaked the robes, the robes would be even colder and more uncomfortable. The rough but thick fur robes could not just resist the cold, but even more importantly, they could not allow the blood that sprayed on the body to seep into the robes. The sticky blood flowed down Li Shixing's robes like syrup. Even though he was so used to it, it was like an instinct. He could not help but feel disgust whenever he faced such a moment. He did not deliberately suppress and forget this feeling, because if he became numb to killing, he would become numb to many things. Other than the three at the front, the rest of the Wuji scout troop had fallen off their horses. The most threatening cultivator had been killed by his sword. Now, no one could escape more than 300 feet. This was no different from what he had expected at the start. Yet the corners of his mouth started to tremble. His cold and determined eyes were filled with shock. He felt the ground tremble. He accurately stabbed his sword into the heart of a Wuji soldier charging from behind him. When the blood sprayed from the soldier's heart onto his back, he did his best to raise his head and look into the distance. A new horizon appeared in the world that was about to be completely dark. An unnatural gust of wind blew across the wasteland, causing the withered grass to sway like waves of wheat. When Li Shixing looked up, Hu Jingjing's breathing stopped again. That was a cavalry army that was still in a horizontal line and sweeping over like a wave. She could not see the end of the army on both sides. This was the majority of the cavalry army. Her breathing stopped, but her heart was rapidly contracting, sending blood surging into every part of her body. Her mind was already rumbling along with the sound of horse hooves in the wind. Theoretically, there should be two groups of scouts in front of this cavalry army. This was not from Li Shixing's experience and conjecture, but from his investigation. Based on normal speed, the majority of the cavalry army would only arrive when it was completely dark. There were countless possibilities why the majority of the cavalry army had come early, but Li Shixing knew that he and Hu Jingjing did not have the time to consider these possibilities. When the Wuji cavalry drew into a line, they could quickly change their formation and fire arrows at the same time from both sides. This was an unbridled demonstration when they had the advantage. The charge of this formation could easily form a cylindrical encirclement. Even a Realm 7 cultivator trapped in the center of 3,000 cavalry could not survive, much less cultivators like him and Hu Jingjing. He had to make a choice immediately. However, what he didn't expect was that Hu Jingjing had made her choice earlier than him. Not far behind him, behind the three Wuji cavalry, countless withered grass suddenly lit up dreamily. Looking at the grass that lit up like jewels and gave off beautiful yellow light, Li Shixing's body froze. He did not understand what Hu Jingjing was doing. The yellow light spread across the plains. In the middle of the 3,000 Wuji cavalry, there was a rider who was small and thin compared to the other riders. Yet he carried 5 curved blades on his back. The hilts of the blades were blood-colored and rippled with primal energies of the universe. There were 4 knights on either side of him. They did not carry any weapons on their backs. Instead, they carried huge copper shields. This rider also wore a mask made directly from the skull of a tiger. Even the fangs had not been pulled out of the skull. The fiendish energy was astounding. He also saw the yellow crystal light shining on the grassland. The depths of his eyes were immediately filled with a confused light. He released a simple syllable from his throat. The entire cavalry army that was originally running wildly suddenly slowed down along with the horse he sat on. The yellow light on the tips of the grass grew thicker and finally came out in threads. A powerful and profound aura formed between these shining blades of grass. In the perception of cultivators, it was as if there was an enormous and invisible mirror erected between these blades of grass. As the grass swayed, a glowing yellow sword light crossed the distance exceeding the limits of flying swords and cut through the 3 Wuji riders. The 3 riders were cut at the waist and blood sprayed. What do you want to do? Li Shixing came in front of Hu Jingjing. The reason he could quickly face Hu Jingjing was not just because he was moving through the grass like a wolf, but also because Hu Jingjing was quickly approaching him. The yellow light on the tips of the grass had not faded. Hu Jingjing's powerful sword essence had not dissipated, and caused the fragile leaves around her to break. Two more attacks. Hu Jingjing looked at Li Shixing covered in blood and panted. "I want to gamble?" Li Shixing looked at the light flashing in her eyes and understood her meaning. He grew silent. She even used such an extravagant sword strike to deal with 3 ordinary knights. She wanted to let the army on the other side feel that there were many cultivators like her here. Putting aside the fact that the two of us might not be able to escape, even if the two of us can escape from this cavalry army will still find the remnants of my troops and kill them all. Hu Jingjing knew he understood. She took a deep breath and said, "This is my choice. You can leave first." Li Shixing glanced at her. He always looked at people like a wolf on the grasslands. At this time, there was some habitual coldness. But he did not give a reason and simply said, "I will gamble with you." After saying this, he pulled out another sword. It was a small sword that was tied to his leg. This sword was pure black without any reflection, just like the purest night. Hu Jingjing was inexplicably moved. With this action, she knew what she should do now. She attacked. She gritted her teeth and made the vital energy in her body flow furiously again. The wild vital energy charged through her meridians, causing many cracks to appear on her meridians that had reached their limits. Blood flowed out of the corner of her mouth. Blood mist started to squeeze out of her pores. The yellow jade sword in her hand flowed with a crystalline light, summoning the surrounding chi of heaven and earth and injecting it into the stems of the weeds. Then, the stems of the weeds were like even more small swords. The channels and meridians in the roots that usually absorb nutrients also began to absorb chi of heaven and earth, and then blossom from the tips of the weeds. Li Shixing attacked. A black sword light appeared in front of Hu Jingjing. Then, like an arrow, it was bounced away by an invisible power in the grasslands. Its speed was many times faster than any arrow in the world. When the black sword light landed, it turned into many black threads that were hard to see with the naked eye, like black cow hair. Hu Jingjing felt the sword intent, and her eyes were instantly filled with disbelief. This is the black hair wind sword essence of Celestial Iron Sword School. Li Shixing did not look at her, but seemed to guess her thoughts. He said coldly, "Before I was expelled from Chongling, I was the youngest student in the history of Celestial Iron Sword School." A furious howl exploded in the last light of dusk. Among the 3,000 riders, the rider with the tiger skull mask stretched his hands forward as if he was praying. The 5 scimitars on his back flew up like flying swords, instantly turning into 5 blood moons, emitting a dazzling red light. These 5 blood moons flew out rapidly and blocked most of the falling black sword threads. Pew 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 pew. The remaining black sword threads fell, bringing out plumes of bloody mist. Dozens of riders fell to the ground along with their horses. When the black sword threads pierced their bodies, there was only an extremely small wound. Even they themselves did not feel any pain. However, in the next moment, the wounds in the depths of their bodies grew larger and larger. There is one more attack. Li Shixing looked at Hu Jingjing, who was still bleeding from the corner of her mouth, took a deep breath, and said. Hu Jingjing coughed. With her cultivation, to be able to use the secret sword of Treasure Light Temple required her vital energy to reach the limit. Yet if she wanted the other to believe that there were many powerful cultivators here, she had to do as Li Shixing said, and make each attack different. Every sword strike was different. For her, the only thing she could do now was to make every sword strike stronger. When one made a choice, they would be nervous before they made it. But if they had no choice, they would become relaxed. She was like this right now. Therefore, as she coughed incessantly, she did not hold back at all as she pushed all the true origin in her body into her meridians in an instant. A string of explosions sounded inside her body. The sword in her hand was so bright it seemed to turn into light. The yellow light that gushed out from the tip of the grass was also extremely moist, as if oil was about to seep out from it. Li Shixing put down the sword in his hand. Waves of mysterious sword essence gushed out from his body at the same time. Hu Jingjing's eyes widened. She felt as if there was an invisible wall in the sky. Chapter 442. In the next moment, Hu Jingjing sprayed blood from her mouth. She felt as though she was going to vomit all the blood in her body. The invisible wall in the sky was already falling toward the cavalry. The cultivator wearing the tiger skull mask among the 3,000 cavalry roared out in shock and fury. The 5 blood moons circling about his body flew upwards, smashing fiercely into the invisible wall that was descending from above. The invisible wall broke apart, turning into a wild wind and sharp sword energy. There seemed to be countless enormous, transparent swords in the sky charging towards the ground. The 5 blood moons only bought some time for the cavalry. Under this tiger skull-masked cultivator's furious roar, this cavalry army completely entered a state of chaos, rapidly retreating in chaos. The scattered transparent swords fell into the scattered cavalry and immediately created large amounts of blood. In reality, these blades had only killed 20 or so soldiers. Most of the casualties were the horses that couldn't dodge in time. When they realized that they couldn't block this kind of power, the riders on the horses immediately dismounted. However, the chaotic scene that was created was exceptionally ghastly. City guarding sword. Hu Jingjing felt she was about to die, yet she, who was even more shocked than the Wuji soldiers, still managed to find the strength to shout out of nowhere. Then she fell forward to the ground. The moment before she fainted, she was still thinking that this was Mo Shouqing's sword essence. In her knowledge, Huang Jinwei was the heir of the old man who had forced her master to death. But why had such a sword essence not appeared in Huang Jinwei's hands, but in Li Shixing's? Li Shixing did not care about her questions and feelings. He quickly shoved a pill in her mouth, and then with a rough slap, forced the pill down her throat into her stomach. His attention remained fixed on the disorderly cavalry. The cavalry were trying to control the formation, but did not dare to advance. He knew that Hu Jingjing, this Chongling young woman who had not listened to his orders, had won the gamble this time. He took a deep breath, reached out, and put Hu Jingjing on his back. He passed through the grass for a moment, and then his fingers dug into the soil to pull out another copper wire. The lower end of the copper wire was connected to more copper wires. As he exerted force, these copper wires that were not laid out in a straight line started to move. Dozens of wave-like lines appeared in the grass around him, as though many cultivators were quickly moving through the plains. Then he also retreated. This time he did not deliberately hide his figure. This was because he knew that the best puzzle was a mixture of truth and falsehood. Only when the enemy's attention was attracted by some real scenes would they overlook some rigid traces. The 3,000 cavalrymen retreated 500 feet and regained their footing. Looking at the waves of grass in the wilderness ahead, especially the wave of dust Li Shixing left behind when he retreated, the cultivator, wearing the tiger skull mask, who was clearly the highest commander of this cavalry, was silent for a moment. Then he gave off some indescribable sounds. Several riders beside him spoke at the same time, as if they wanted to object. However, they were met with even more severe reprimands. No one around him dared to make a sound. The 3,000 cavalry began to retreat, disappearing into the darkness behind them. The general dismounted as well. His warhorse was taken with the cavalry as they retreated. When the hooves almost disappeared, a curved blade on the general's back flew up like a blood moon. This curved blade rose higher and higher. After many breaths, the sound of dry grass snapping came from behind the general, and then quickly came to his side. An enormous wolf appeared next to him. This was a huge green wolf that was much larger than an ordinary wild wolf. There was a saddle on the enormous wolf's back, and even some food and thick blankets tied up. The general patted the enormous wolf's head and then sat on the saddle. The medicinal power acted up in Hu Jingjing's stomach. The wild medicinal power charged into her meridians. It could not quickly regenerate the damaged parts of her meridians, but it went deep into her bones and stimulated her blood to produce large amounts of energy. The pain of rebirth caused Hu Jingjing to quickly wake up. Then she vomited blood again. It is best if you do not look up. Otherwise, any blade of grass can blind your eyes. Just as she instinctively wanted to look up and see the surroundings, Li Shixing's voice reached her ears. She completely woke up and realized that Li Shixing was running quickly through the grass with her on his back. We succeeded? She obediently did not look up and asked weakly. Li Shixing was silent for many breaths and said, "The cavalry has retreated." Hu Jingjing felt joy. Then she sensed the unimaginably domineering, medicinal power in her body. She started to pay attention to her body and was shocked. "What pill medicine is this?" "White bone blood birth pill," Li Shixing answered simply. "This is Han." Hu Jingjing gaped in disbelief and could not speak. "This is the strongest healing pill medicine from the Han Imperial Palace," Li Shixing said simply. Li Shixing said simply, "It is because I have pills like this that Father is not worried about me living here." Hu Jingjing was even more shocked and speechless. Then Li Shixing said, "But this is the last one." Hu Jingjing was stunned for many breaths before she struggled to say, "Thank you." Li Shixing was silent for a moment and said, "No need to thank me. When the cavalry appeared, I did not have the time to think of a perfect solution." Hu Jingjing's face was pressed against his back. The fur on his back was already soaked in blood and was frozen like boiled leather. However, as he ran, there was still some heat coming from his back, making the heavily injured Hu Jingjing feel warm. She hesitated for a long time and asked, "How do you know Mo Shoqing's city-guarding sword?" Li Shixing also hesitated for a long time. He feared that he was the least talkative of all the young talents in Chongling, and the worst at talking to people. But he still felt he had to say something. "Do not hate Mo Shoqing." He hesitated for a long time and said seriously, "What he did was not for himself." "You mean that as long as it is not for himself, then this person is usually noble?" Hu Jingjing thought of the sword light that night, and her voice grew cold. "No matter how much I hate him, he is already dead." Li Shixing did not refute her words. He could understand her feelings. "At least for me, he is the one who knows how to stay out of things and control the balance of Chongling." Hu Jingjing did not understand his meaning and listened silently. "He will try to make up for some people's mistakes." Li Shixing continued, "Before I was expelled from Chongling, the people of my age in Chongling could not beat me. If I had set Min Mountain Sword Sect as my goal, I should have entered Min Mountain Sword Sect faster than Duanmu Jingzong and the others. But I was expelled from Chongling. He taught me the Citadel sword as compensation for being banished here, as well as a reward for what I've done here." Hu Jingjing struggled to breathe and said slowly, "I admit that he was a good person to you, but to our Treasure Light Temple, he is a sinner. But he is dead, so I will not judge him." The night was deep. Everything seemed to have been washed and returned to black. Li Shixing, who had been running with his head bowed, stopped. "Where are we going next?" Hu Jingjing asked. Li Shixing slowly turned and said coldly, "We may not be able to go anywhere after this." Hearing his unusual tone, Hu Jingjing, who had been listening without looking up, looked up. She looked up like him into the distant night. "Someone is chasing us?" she asked Li Shixing softly. "A cultivator much stronger than us?" Li Shixing did not answer. "Go!" Hu Jingjing took a deep breath and said, "You should be able to leave alone. Do not speak, do not obstruct me from thinking," Li Shixing said coldly and rudely. Hu Jingjing's brow furrowed deeply. She did not say anything else and did not struggle. Li Shixing had put her down. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword, but he stood motionlessly in front of her. In the distant night, a strange sound finally appeared. Then, it turned into a hurricane that broke through the sky. A green shadow rushed out of the dark night, bringing with it countless pieces of withered yellow grass, bringing with it a strong gust of wind, and barged into her line of sight. "Hey, you are hey!" A strange hissing sound rang out in the dark night with endless hidden anger, as if there were black flames spreading in the night sky. Li Shixing's eyes narrowed slightly. Looking at the enormous indigo wolf that represented the Wuji royal family, he started to feel cold. Chapter 443. Wuji survived in the plains and lived fairly well. In the view of outsiders, They mainly relied on cows, sheep, and horses. Yet the Wuji knew that their ancestors mainly relied on hunting to survive. The deer in the plains had once been their main source of food, and the wolves had been their greatest enemy. So the wolf and deer became the two most important holy objects in their totems. The Wuji challenged the harsh living environment and then challenged all-powerful things that threatened them. One tribe finally conquered the strongest wolf pack in the plains, and that tribe united all the tribes in the plains and became the Wuji royal family. The strongest wolf pack was a true gray wolf. Their fur was blue, and they were enormous. They had astounding strength and agility, and even the endurance of horses. Only the royal family of Wuji could possess a wolf like this as a mount. Earlier, in the last light before the sun set, Li Shixing had seen the owner of the 5 blood moons. He saw that the person wearing the tiger skull mask was the commander of the 3,000 cavalry. Yet he had not expected this person to be of the royal family of Wuji. I had not expected the commander of a 3,000 cavalry army to be of the royal family of Wuji. Li Shixing slowly looked up and met the authoritative gaze behind the tiger skull mask. He slowly said, "I had not expected someone like you to dare to leave the group and chase alone." The gray wolf landed on the ground. As it panted heavily, gusts of wind seemed to blow in front of it. The Wuji commander sitting on the saddle was not in a hurry to move. He looked at Li Shixing and Hu Jingjing and said in Guangzhong dialect, "You did not think of many things, so you suffered such a defeat. But the war has just started. You have already moved in full force, and we are just the vanguard." Li Shixing shook his head coldly. "No matter how much you place your hopes on another dynasty, Wuji will not have a good result. So what if we die together?" The Wuji commander on the saddle looked at Li Shixing and sneered. "Even if Wuji only has a few thousand people left, we are still Wuji. 1,000 years later, Wuji will still exist on the plains. But if you pay a great price, maybe in 100 years, there will be no Qin dynasty." Li Shixing was silent for a moment and said, "So I also do not wish to fight." The Wuji commander laughed coldly. Are these words not laughable coming from Zhao's mouth? Li Shixing looked at him and slowly said, "I only killed Wuji people who robbed some border trade caravans." The Wuji general sneered. If not for the Qin dynasty purposefully attacking the distant and attacking the nearby to restrict border trade with Wuji, why would the Wuji rob the merchant caravans passing through the Wuji border? Behind Li Shixing, Hu Jingjing looked at Li Shixing's back. The shock and respect in her eyes grew stronger. Just from listening to these conversations, she started to understand what Li Shixing, this youth abandoned by Chongling, had done in these years and what kind of reputation he had. But while the Wuji people knew this, most people in Chongling did not. There is no answer to this question. Li Shixing looked coldly at the Wuji general. "I am just an insignificant cultivator. What I can do is to protect those merchant caravans and not be casually slaughtered like sheep. In reality, I respect you very much, especially when I chased you and found that the two of you managed to lure my cavalry away." The Wuji general did not argue. After a long moment of silence, he said, "So I decided to give you the courtesy of a true warrior. I am Wu Lianzi, the 5th imperial prince of Wuji. I want to have a fair fight with you, and then take your head." "I agree." Li Shixing looked at this imperial prince and said, "If you first disperse most of your vital energy." Wu Lianzi looked up slightly at Li Shixing's disdainful face. Anger rose in his eyes, but he did not speak and forced his vital energy out of his fingertips. His hands started to shine. Streaks of red true essence, carrying an indescribable fragrance, fell on the withered grass on both sides. In the darkness of the grass, it was as if there were 10 beautiful flowers blooming on the grass. Hu Jingjing looked in disbelief at this scene. She had not expected the other to actually do this. At this time, she felt a slight prickling pain on her arm. Some of Li Shixing's hair seemed to be blown by the wind and stabbed her arm. But these strands of hair reminded her through the prickling pain that it was not because of the wind. She sensed the words the strands of hair were tattooing on her arm. She felt even more disbelief and even shame. Almost there, Wu Lianzi was stern and focused. His gaze was like two sharp swords. His slow and determined words revealed his strong confidence and pride. He was clearly shorter than Li Shixing, but he gave people the feeling he was looking down on them. Almost there, Li Shixing repeated the same words, and then he held his sword across his chest. At this time, he held a pale, white long sword in his hand. The seal scripts were three slanted straight lines that randomly extended to the tip of the sword. The night wind suddenly grew wild and gave off terrifying roars in front of him. Li Shixing was recognized as strong among the younger generation of cultivators in Chongling. Now, in a true battle of life and death, he was filled with an indescribable cold-blooded presence. A pale white sword light like a fong lit up. Dozens of feet away, it moved in a strange and unfathomable arc in the air and cut towards Wu Lianzi. When this sword light appeared, Wu Lianzi started to sprint. His toes tapped on the yellow leaves, and he moved through the air like the wind. The 5 curved blades on his back flew out and danced around him like 5 blood moons. The sword light landed on the 5 blood moons. After the pale, white sword light scattered in all directions, the tiger skull mask on his face also started to show countless fine cracks like spider webs. However, his gaze was still extremely confident and proud. A domineering shout came out of his mouth and caused the tiger bone fragments outside his lips to shoot out. 5 blood moons surrounded his body and stood in front of him like soldiers. They gradually merged together and turned into a large and thick blood red long saber. His hand gripped this excessively heavy long saber, and the vital essence in his body surged out crazily. The air was compressed, and in an instant, there was a thunderous sound. Facing such a terrifying attack, Li Shixing's expression grew colder. The sword in his hand did not make any subsequent movements, but the vital essence that flowed out of his body instantly created an invisible giant wall in the sky above him. Then he smashed this enormous wall down in front of him. The tiger bone mask on Wu Lianzi's face fell like pieces of porcelain. His long blade did not slash forward, but first stabbed upwards like a stick. There was a loud bang. It was like he had poked a hole in the sky. The giant wall was also pierced through, leaving behind a hole. The enormous power fell to the ground, but he was in the hole. The ground shook. A deep, wall-like mark appeared on both sides of his body, about 10 feet wide. He defeated this attack, but in the next moment, Wu Lianzi, who had not been injured, screamed in anger. The moment he had made a hole in the enormous wall, Hu Jingjing had attacked from behind Li Shixing. A candlelight like sword light did not fall towards his body, but passed by him close to the ground. The sword light landed on the enormous indigo wolf not far behind him. This attack was not strong for cultivators, especially after Hu Jingjing was seriously injured. In Wu Lianzi's view, the power of this attack was extremely weak. Yet he had not expected Hu Jingjing to attack at this time after Li Shixing agreed to a fair fight. This was not a strong attack, but it was enough against an enormous wolf. As he screamed in anger, the enormous indigo wolf, who had sensed danger, rushed up, but the light yellow sword light still swept across its 2 hind legs. The 2 hind legs were cut off, and blood sprayed. Li Shixing had retreated. He grabbed Hu Jingjing's body and threw her onto his back like a sandbag. Then he quickly bent down and passed through the grass behind him. Apologies. Amidst Wu Lianzi's almost hysterical screams, Li Shixing lowered his head and murmured softly to himself, "This is a war, not a grudge between 2 people." Chapter 444. As Wu Lianzi screamed in fury, the tiger skull mask he wore turned to pieces and fell off his face. Under the shattered tiger skull mask was a face that was too exquisite and handsome for the Wuji people. This was an imperial son with a delicate face. Even in Chongling, he could be considered a handsome man. But the most important thing was that his eyes were light gray. In Wuji, only when a Wuji man married a Yu woman would they have descendants with eyes like this. The Yuezhi had been conquered by the Qin long ago and became a vassal country of the Qin. In the eyes of the other countries and tribes on the plains, the Yuezhi people were the symbol of weakness and lowliness. Shameless. Looking at the enormous blue wolf howling in pain after losing its hind legs, the Wuji imperial son screamed in fury again. He had never thought that after Li Shixing agreed to fight him fairly, he would have Hu Jingjing secretly attack. Why? Hu Jingjing, who was lying on Li Shixing's back, could not understand. Reputation is more important than life and death, right? If I do this, I will shame all the people of Qin, right? Li Shixing asked her in return. Then he took a deep breath and said coldly, I only know that if I live, many Qin people will not have to die. I only know that in a situation of extreme anger, he will want to continue to pursue me. He will not immediately go back to find the cavalry he leads. That way, the remnants of the army you were in before, and the remnants of the same army, can live. Hu Jingjing was silent for a long time. For some reason, she thought of her dead master, and Mo Shoqing, who had also died. From a great distance, there was a blurry black line under the sky in the northwestern part of the Qin dynasty's territory. But when one was close, one would know that this blurry black line was a lofty and cold mountain range. Especially when set off by the yellow plains in front and behind, this enormous mountain shrouded in clouds and snow appeared even more majestic and unreachable. It made people feel small and insignificant. It made people feel that a god lived here. This was Yin Mountain, a sacred mountain in the hearts of many herdsmen who had lived in this area for generations. Passing through some naturally formed huge canyons in the mountains and seeing the unimaginable scenery that could only be described as majestic and spectacular was an indescribable experience for most people who came here for the first time. They couldn't help but feel like they were on a pilgrimage. However, for the 3,000 Imperial Guard army that had rushed through Yin Mountain, they only felt exhaustion and confusion, as well as fear of the unknown. Guyu Pass was located in one of the 7 natural openings in the Yin Mountain that were suitable for the army to pass through. The Qin dynasty naturally had to firmly control these 7 breaches. However, the most important thing was that Guyu Pass was originally the furthest away from the hinterland behind Yin Mountain. From a strategic point of view, if the Wuji and even further Donghu armies passed through here and entered the plains behind Yin Mountain, the Qin dynasty's army would have enough time to move. They could open an opening and set up an encirclement. So this pass was not just the smallest, but also the last to be built. The other border cities were not only built to completely connect the 2 ends of the canyon, forming an iron gate. Some of the lower places on the mountain ridges on both sides were even built with city walls and turrets as long as it was possible for the army to pass through, connecting them to the border cities. Yet Guyu Pass had not been completely built. It was located to the north and was not connected to the mountain for a long time. This caused it to be at most a city built on a mountain slope. At this time, tens of thousands of Qin remnants were being driven by the Wuji army towards this pass with the weakest defenses. Even the lowest-ranking Qin soldiers could understand the intention of the cavalry to cut off their path of retreat. They did not just want to kill the tens of thousands of Qin soldiers in one go, but also eat up this Guyu Pass. In the future, even if the Wuji army did not counterattack after entering Yin Mountain, their arrangements could lean towards this side. When the Donghu reinforcements arrived, it would be easier for them to form an alliance with Wuji. As to some Qin dynasty armies that had reached the Wuji border, they would become isolated islands. It was just a matter of time before they were destroyed. Guyu Pass originally had 15,000 guards, but most of them had gone deep into the plains. Right now, there were less than 2,000 guards. So when the 3,000 Imperial Guard army arrived, adding on some workers and craftsmen who did not usually fight, the number of guards and Imperial Guard army here was about even. The highest general left behind here, Wu Qiwu, was of the same rank as Guofeng. When Guofeng arrived with the Imperial Guard army, this thin general, who was still in his prime but looked as old as a man in his 50s, led some other generals to welcome them. Then he silently led Guofeng and some of his deputies, Ding Ning, Nangong Kaishu, and the others to the highest point of the Guyu Pass Tower. After Yin Mountain, there were only meadows at most and no mountain ranges. so one could see very far. You came in time. At most, there's half a day. Their vanguard will arrive here soon. Wu Qiwu looked coldly at the smoke in the distance and said, even the vanguard has at least 5,000. After a pause, this thin general said simply and directly, logically speaking, they should have arrived half a day earlier. Based on our deductions, the reason they did not travel at full speed is because they did not want to be separated from the main army. The reason the main army is slow should be because they brought a lot of military equipment. They seized a lot of military equipment in their previous battles with us. Guofeng took a deep breath and said coldly, when will our tens of thousands arrive? 2.5 days. Wu Qiwu gritted his teeth and said, also, the Wuji army will follow soon. There is a 2-day time difference. At least 10,000 Wuji soldiers will have 2 days to deal with us. All of the Qin generals had ugly expressions, except for Ding Ning. The vanguard has more than 5,000, and most of them are carrying military equipment. There must be more than 5,000. So this Wuji army is at least 11,000, and maybe even more. When Guofeng's gaze turned to Ding Ning said calmly, even if we add up to more than 5,000, we cannot be considered an elite army. So what can stop them? This place was very far from Chongling, and the transmission of information was not as smooth as in Chongling. The ordinary soldiers and generals here did not know many things about Chongling. Wu Qiwu and the general next to him did not know what identity Ding Ning had. But seeing that he was able to follow closely behind Guofeng and had a presence that ordinary young cultivators could not compare to, he did not underestimate him. After a moment of silence, he said, there are more than 2,500 laborers in the mines of Guyu Pass. More than half of them are criminals exiled here. Ding Ning looked at him with a scornful smile and said, you mean to give freedom to these laborers and criminals and have them take up weapons to fight against the enemy? Wu Qiwu frowned. He did not like Ding Ning's attitude right now. Those who can be exiled here are usually serious criminals. Usually, in order to make them obedient, you must have made them suffer a lot. If they are released now, I fear they will first deal with you, and not the Wuji army, Ding Ning said coolly. 5,000, 2,500. Kill some of the leaders and those who resist fiercely, Wu Qiwu said coldly. Even if there are only 1,000 left, they will be useful. I fear you will first tire yourself from killing and become disappointed, Ding Ning said mockingly. Wu Qiwu took a deep breath. Seeing such a junior openly mocking him, he was naturally angry. He sneered and said, then what do you think? How about we abandon the city? Ding Ning looked calmly at this general whose eyes were filled with murderousness. He turned and pointed at the slope on the side. The entire army will be stationed high up on the slope. From high up, the cavalry will not have an advantage. Even if they take over the city, that slope can at least allow the remnants of our army to retreat to Yin Mountain when they arrive. What we need to do is last for 2 days and occupy that slope in these 2 days. All the Qin generals looked at the slope Ding Ning pointed at. Wu Qiwu stilled for a moment and then sneered in anger. This is absurd. Even if that slope is higher up, it has lost the support of some of the military equipment at the city gates. Abandon the city first and wait for the majority of the vanguard cavalry to arrive, especially when the military equipment arrives. We will undoubtedly die. How can we last for 2 days? I do not care about your opinion. Ding Ning turned to look at Guofeng and said seriously, I only care about our opinion. This time, I need the Imperial Guard army to listen to my opinion. Guofeng stilled. If they do not abandon the city, then the Imperial Guard army will camp on that slope. Ding Ning looked at him and added. Hearing his words, the expressions of Wu Qiwu and the others turned extremely ugly. Guofeng still found it hard to believe. This concerns who will lead this battle. Ding Ning looked at him and said slowly, who will command this battle? You must believe me. After a pause, Ding Ning looked at him and said softly, you must listen to me. Only then can we win this battle. Guofeng swallowed his saliva with difficulty. He hesitated for a long time. Based on his past experience, this was a mistake of splitting before the battle and not beneficial to the battle. But in the end, he took a deep breath and nodded. Chapter 445. So what if he is the winner of the Min Mountain Sword Trials? He is just an ignorant youth who has never been on the battlefield. That Guofeng is muddle-headed to have the Imperial Guard army listen to his command. Even the stupidest general wouldn't make such a mistake. Seeing Ding Ning, Guofeng, and the others turn and leave, the faces of several generals of the border army became extremely gloomy. Wu Qiwu's expression was also extremely unsightly, and the depths of his eyes were filled with fierce, killing intent. If he had absolute confidence just now, he would choose to kill Ding Ning. The 3,000 Imperial Guard army that had just entered the city started to leave the city. They moved to a higher slope and started to set up camp. The reinforcements had left the city due to disagreements. This was a great blow to the morale of the army in the city. This was even more so for the Imperial Guard army, who were extremely tired from the march. If Ding Ning had not shown his ability to convince all of them before, these soldiers would have rebelled due to their negative emotions when they encountered some difficulties while moving some heavy military equipment up the mountain. Guofeng was an experienced general. He knew that morale and emotions were more important than some powerful military equipment. He followed Ding Ning to a high rock. Looking at the smoke in the distance, his expression was not much better than Wu Qiwu's. In reality, I still do not understand why you have to abandon the city. He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself down as he looked at Ding Ning in front of him. Ding Ning did not turn to look at him and said softly, "In reality, I do not really want to abandon the city." His answer stunned Guofeng and Nangong Kaishu, who was following closely behind him. "What do you mean?" Nangong Kaishu could not help but ask. "Guyu Pass is very special," Ding Ning said softly and slowly. "It is not just that the pass is not as grand as other pass cities. Even more importantly, you should have seen when you entered the city that many of the people in the pass are from the Yuezhi and the border people of the Yin Mountain area." Guofeng's eyebrows suddenly jumped. He realized something, but he wasn't sure. Ding Ning did not stop and continued. Guyu Pass was the last to be built. Many of the laborers were recruited from nearby areas, and many of them were eventually recruited as soldiers. Therefore, the people in this city are very complicated. Nangong Kaishu finally reacted and said, "You are afraid that our actions in the city will be leaked by the spies?" Ding Ning looked away from the distant horizon and turned around. He looked at Guofeng and Nangong Kaishu and nodded. "While Wuji won a great victory, they should not know that all of our reinforcements have arrived. Yet this rear guard fearlessly came here because they know the situation of the garrison in this city." Nothing is too deceitful in war. He said that he wanted them to abandon the city, but he didn't agree with them and went to the hillside where the troops were stationed. He was just putting on a show for the other party. After a pause, Ding Ning looked seriously at Nangong Kaishu and said, "When it comes to acting, the fewer people know, the more real it is when even your own people are kept in the dark." Nangong Kaishu looked at Ding Ning and felt even more awe. "Then what should we do next?" "We will continue to act and have the vanguard attack us first." Ding Ning looked at her and said, "I want you to send a letter to Wu Qiwu and have him cooperate with us to put on this show." The distant smoke had extinguished. As time passed, the ground started to tremble. Before sunset, the 5,000 Wuji cavalry officially appeared in the sight of the Guyu Pass border army. The uniforms and armor of the Wuji cavalry were not uniform. At this time, they did not have a fixed formation like a cloud that could change at any time on the grasslands. Yet the weapons of these cavalry hung from the sides of the saddles, and the steps of the horses were shockingly uniform. As the horses galloped, these weapons naturally hit the saddles and gave off rhythmic sounds. This uniform sound continued to ring out, bringing with it a kind of fatal magic that made it difficult for everyone to breathe smoothly, and their hearts beat more and more violently. Ding Ning sat on a large protruding rock and looked silently at the cavalry coming under the setting sun. He frowned slightly in thought. On the tower of Guyu Pass, Wu Qiwu's back started to sweat uncontrollably. As the thunderous hooves approached, his vision was gradually filled by the cavalry. The trembling of the ground caused all of Guyu Pass to seem to jump. Some of the accumulated dust in the cracks of the walls fell in the cold wind. As early as an hour ago, he had already learned of the young man's plan to deal with the cavalry. Until now, he was the only one in the entire Guyu Pass who knew of this plan, so all the pressure was naturally on him. Even though he felt respect for the youth and felt it was feasible, this was still a great gamble for him. If the cavalry army didn't attack the Imperial Guard army on the hillside as expected, then Guyu Pass might be lost. But when the light on the saddles of the cavalry entered his sight, and he glanced at the Imperial Guard army on the slope, he knew he had no choice. It could be said that the youth was using the lives of 3,000 Imperial Guard army soldiers to force him to make such a choice. His expression became extremely unsightly once again. However, he squeezed out a few simple syllables from his throat, then whispered a few words to a deputy general who followed closely behind him. Hearing his words, the vice-general's eyes filled with shock, but then he recovered at a shout. "How are you so sure that the vanguard of the cavalry will attack us first?" Nangon Kaishu appeared behind Ding Ning. She was not questioning him, but humbly asking for guidance. The cavalry in her field of vision was still maintaining a straight path and did not show whether they were heading towards the city or the slope. But for some reason, she had a strong feeling that the cavalry would attack them first, just like Ding Ning had predicted. She was like Jing Lioli in the summer. She started to take Ding Ning as her teacher and learn from Ding Ning. Any army that advances quickly cannot be too large. 14 or 15,000 is the limit. Otherwise, they cannot maintain speed, and even their rations cannot keep up. Ding Ning answered her question slowly and clearly. The military intelligence says that the total number of this cavalry is around 10,000. Based on my judgment, it may be more than that. At most, there are around 14,000. But we have more than 25,000 Qin remnants that have retreated here. You have to understand, the army of the Qin dynasty is the strongest army in the world. After a pause, Ding Ning turned to look at her. Even if they are remnants, no one dares to underestimate the army of the Qin dynasty. Therefore, the cavalry would try to minimize their losses as much as possible to win this battle and occupy Guyu Pass. Otherwise, if they take Guyu Pass, they will only have a few thousand people left. I fear that even they do not have the confidence to stop the 20,000 Qin army with these few thousand people, even for a short time. Nangon Kaishu understood. Her eyes lit up. So no matter how wild and risky the Wuji army appeared before, at least here, this cavalry army will be very careful. Ding Ning looked at her and nodded. Nangon Kaishu took a deep breath and said, "Because of your intentional arrangements, the Imperial Guard army has not prepared much of our equipment and is in chaos. So this cavalry army will attack us first. For them, 2 days is enough. They only need to use the smallest price to get rid of the Qin army here. They're not in a hurry." Ding Ning's eyes showed approval. He said at the same time, "Even more importantly, in such a situation, if we cause them to suffer heavy losses and cause their initial plans to fail, they will panic." Nangon Kaishu looked at his calm and confident gaze. Her heartbeat sped up again. "So you felt from the start that we could win this battle, even if the enemy has 3 times our number." Ding Ning glanced at her and said, "Whether we can win in the end depends on whether Wu Qiwu will listen to the contents of my letter and send out all the cultivators and the best fighting swordsmen in the city." Nangon Kaishu raised her head and looked at the approaching cavalry army. She looked at the dust that covered the last rays of the setting sun. She knew that this was a difficult decision for the general to make. Since the Qin dynasty, cultivators and the guards who worked with cultivators were the most important power in the Qin dynasty army. Even though there were less than 100 cultivators and guards in the city, if all these people were taken out of the city, this city pass would be no different from an empty city. But she instinctively knew that the general, who was much more experienced than her, would make the right choice. Chapter 446. The hooves beat rhythmically on the ground, and the walls of Guyu Pass trembled even more. The dust dragon created by the cavalry even covered the last light of the setting sun, and caused the sky to grow even more chaotic. But there was a sound like a flash of lightning in the air. All the Qin soldiers on the city gate tower suddenly saw a patch of white in front of them. With a howl like a wolf, all the soldiers of this Wuji cavalry pulled out the weapons hanging from their saddles in unison. These unsheathed weapons formed a patch of cold light that illuminated the faces of all the soldiers on the walls. In this suffocating atmosphere, countless soldiers could not help but turn to look at the highest general of this pass, Wu Qiwu. They could not understand why no orders had been given up until now. Wu Qiwu didn't look at the cavalry. Instead, he turned his head to look at the mountain slope. He could vaguely see the youth standing quietly on a high mountain rock. He could not help but feel respect for the youth. Even if it was a huge gamble, no matter what, the youth was able to maintain such calmness under the pressure of such a large army. This was not something an ordinary person could compare with. In just half a cup of tea's time, the range of some of the cavalry's weapons would reach the top of the city gates. At this time, Wu Qiwu finally saw some changes in the cavalry out of the corner of his eye. He suddenly turned his head, his eyes filled with joy. The youth had gambled correctly. A series of strange sounds formed by heavy breathing could be heard from the top of the city gate. When the Qin soldiers on the walls could clearly see the faces of the Wuji cavalry, this cavalry's straightforward charging posture finally changed. The dozens of cavalry at the front changed direction slightly and faced the slope where the Imperial Guard army was. It was as if they were tied by an invisible rope. All the horses behind the dozens of riders changed direction slightly and slowed down abruptly. While they were slow, the hooves of these horses seemed to grow heavier, and a wave of tearing sounds sounded in the air. The hearts of all the Qin soldiers in Guyu Pass contracted violently. This was the violent stone horse. Exploding stone horse was a term used by the Wuji cavalry. It referred to a group of 4 horses. The front 2 were crutch horses with lighter burdens. The back 2 were iron stupas with heavier burdens. Between the front 2 horses and the back 2 horses were leather tools with high elasticity. Relying on the momentum of the front 2 horses, they would pull these special leather tools to their limits, and then throw some heavy stones. These heavy stones had been unusually hard, weathered agate stones of the plains. After being baked by the Wuji people, they became unusually hard and easily shattered. The moment they hit the ground, they would spray out sharp pieces of stone. Other than the few weapons that could only be used by cultivators with vital energy, the normal weapons of the Qin army had a range of 300 paces. But the Wuji cavalry relied on these unique weapons and the power of the horses to throw rocks of a certain weight over 400 paces. The violent stone horse was something that could only be formed by the coordination of weapons, horses, and riders. In Wuji, only a few elite cavalry armies would use it. If they were not careful, the front horse would fall, and the rear horse would fall. The cavalry would fall into chaos and suffer losses. But now, hearing the thunderous sounds, all the Qin soldiers in Guyu Pass who knew the power of this knew that most of the Wuji soldiers in this cavalry army could skillfully grasp the violent stone horse. So this cavalry army was one of the most elite cavalry armies of Wuji. This was not a duel in Chongling, but an invitation with a sword across the chest. When this cavalry army arrived, the battle had already started. Ding Ning looked calmly at this extremely powerful elite Wuji cavalry. He knew that the morale of the Imperial Guard army was extremely low, and they were starting to feel terror and hopelessness. Yet when the leather was pulled to its limits and gave off waves of explosive sounds, he just put his hand down and made a gesture of pressing down. Side, down. Several shrill military orders instantly cut through the suffocating air. All of the Imperial Guard army soldiers had been waiting for orders for a long time. When they finally heard the orders, most of the Imperial Guard army soldiers instinctively carried out the orders and lay down sideways. Most of the soldiers had a shallow ditch in front of them that was not deep or wide. It was just enough for them to fit in sideways. Just as they instinctively carried out the orders, there was a sharp howl. The dust above the Wuji cavalry dissipated, and a patch of glittering rain appeared. In the next moment, the rain reached the Imperial Guard army. Pew pew pew. Clouds of dust covered the front line of the Imperial Guard army like waves. Then there were countless sizzling sounds and clanging sounds. The entire formation was almost covered in flying sharp crystals. All of the Imperial Guard army soldiers lying sideways in the ditch paled and felt sharp energies passing through the world. Yet, most of the Imperial Guard army soldiers found they were safe. There were not many casualties. Only when the dust and debris from the sharp rocks fell and covered their bodies did most of them wake up. Lying on one side would greatly reduce the possibility of being hit by the sharp rocks. Furthermore, the fragments of the sharp rocks would only shoot out from the ground and were not much of a threat. These shallow ditches could not be seen from a distance. At least, the Wuji cavalry, who had just arrived and launched a fierce attack, could not see the shallow ditches they had dug behind the many bunkers on the slope. Before the battle started, none of the Imperial Guard soldiers understood why Ding Ning had given such an order, and why he had them waste time digging such a tunnel that could not stop horses and could not be squatted in. But just now, the timely and accurate military order clearly reminded them that these shallow ditches were to deal with the exploding stone horses of the Wuji cavalry. How had Ding Ning done this? They were not the border army. Most of them did not know that Wuji's most elite cavalry had such terrifying moves. How did Ding Ning know? And how did he predict such an elite cavalry would come? These Imperial Guard soldiers who had woken up could not understand. As they felt more respect for Ding Ning, they grew more nervous. The violent tremors on the ground reminded them that the enemy cavalry had started to charge and were less than 400 paces from them. Even if they disregarded the military order and jumped up, they feared they would not be able to mount an effective defense under the enemy's charge. Also, if they passed another 100 paces, the arrows of the Wuji cavalry would show their power. Under continuous fire, even if they were lying sideways, the dense rain of arrows would cause astounding damage. All of the Qin soldiers who were watching this scene from the towers of Guyu Pass understood this even more clearly as bystanders. Looking at the Wuji cavalry, who were charging up the slope like the tide and did not slow down, the Qin soldiers knew that unless the youth on the rock had a way to stop the cavalry, even for a short time, the Imperial Guard army could only survive. Otherwise, it would be a one-sided slaughter, and the battle would quickly end. Among the dozens of riders at the front of the tide of Wuji cavalry, an exceptionally tall rider had noticed Ding Ning standing on the rock at the back of the Imperial Guard army. At this time, the hooves of his horse suddenly sank, creating 4 sprays of dust. At the same time, a deep indigo bow appeared in his hands. This giant-like rider was astoundingly fast. Before anyone could see clearly, he had pulled the bowstring and shot an arrow. An arrow path suddenly appeared in the chaotic air. An indigo arrow with a white whirlpool accurately fell towards Ding Ning's body. Ding Ning looked at the oncoming arrow and did not move. Standing behind him, Nangong Kaishu narrowed her eyes slightly. With a low shout, she attacked with her sword. Boom, boom, boom. 3 consecutive explosions sounded in the air. Her sword light fiercely collided with this green arrow light. Like splitting firewood, she forcefully hacked this powerful arrow to the ground in front of her. Ding Ning's expression did not change. At the same time, the carriages in front of the dozens of riders that were acting as obstacles lit up with sword lights. Ding Ning flipped his palm upwards. Rise! The sharp military order sounded again. Chapter 447. As the military order sounded and the soldiers lying in the hold jumped up, an even more shrill sound tore through the air at the front of the Wuji cavalry. A thin crimson sword flew out from behind a carriage, instantly accelerating to a speed that ordinary people couldn't catch, and then it flew towards the throat of the giant archer who had just shot out a sword. A skinny rider next to this giant-like rider released a low roar of anger. A flying sword also flew out. With a ding noise, it knocked aside this scarlet flying sword. However, at the same time, a light puff sounded from below the giant rider. The belly of the horse he was riding was pierced through like a hot water bag. A simple and dull earthen small sword made its way out of the earth in an incredibly sinister manner, piercing through the horse's belly and then through the saddle, stabbing towards his body. This giant-like rider let out a cry of shock and anger. He reacted in an instant. His enormous body swept upwards, his hands pulling the green bowstring and twisting it, actually forcibly entangling the small sword that was attacking from below. The leather armor on the rider's arms exploded. Waves of energy surged on his arms. The flying sword containing the vital energy of a Realm 5 cultivator trembled violently in his bowstring and could not break free. However, right at this time, an almost transparent streak of sword radiance descended from the air behind this giant-like rider. The giant-like rider seemed to have sensed something. The moment he turned his head, the sword light streaked across his neck. A red line suddenly appeared on his neck. Then his entire head sprang up like a fountain of hot blood. Countless cries of surprise rang out. These 3 flying swords were not the only ones that appeared in this moment. At least dozens of sword energies gathered primal energies of the universe and cut at the front of the Wuji cavalry. The Imperial Guard soldiers who had just jumped up from the ground saw the sword lights and figures that appeared from the carriages and behind them. They were so shocked they could not believe their eyes. The dozens of riders at the front of this elite Wuji cavalry were clearly powerful cultivators. Even hundreds of soldiers would not be able to stop their charge in an instant. Yet there were almost 100 cultivators in front of them. Why were there almost 100 cultivators here? Just as they were shocked and had no time to think, Ding Ning's raised hand formed a fist and reached forward. The youth's figure was clearly very young, but in the eyes of all the Wuji soldiers and the Qin soldiers on the distant towers, he was filled with an indescribable sense of steel and power. Several heralds were also affected by this strong and indescribable aura. They felt as if their blood was boiling at this moment. Release! Several unprecedented military orders came out of their mouths at the same time. The Imperial Guard Army started to shoot. At this moment, many people in the Imperial Guard Army did not react in unison. Some of the archers and soldiers controlling the weapons could not keep up with the orders. But the orders did not require them to be in order. This military order was only for them to shoot to their heart's content, for them to throw anything that could be thrown high into the air and then fall down heavily, towards the cavalry in front of them to their heart's content. At this time, the charging Wuji cavalry had advanced 300 paces. From the top of the hill, most of the Qin crossbows, including some heavy ordnance, had landed right in the middle of the Wuji cavalry. Even more importantly, the advance of the Wuji cavalry was being forced to stop by these cultivators who suddenly appeared. Hedonism and recklessness usually meant speed, especially under the cover of such an iron presence. An Imperial Guard Army archer's fingers immediately went numb. He did not even notice how many arrows he had shot in the span of a few breaths. It was only now that he discovered that through the obstruction of some carelessly abandoned carriages and supplies, these cavalry troops naturally followed the slowest path up the slope. The density of horses and riders was astonishing. The screams of countless horses and the exploding sounds of flesh and blood merged together. This Wuji cavalry, who had been unstoppable a few breaths ago, exploded in bloody mist like a patch of red flowers blooming. Horses and riders fell and crashed into each other. Even the best riders could not control their steeds in the chaos. Victory would be decided in a flash. Seeing this cavalry army about to be destroyed because of the sudden appearance of the cultivators, a Wuji rider dressed like a shaman, among the dozens of riders at the front waved his hands and gave off obscure and indescribable shouts. These dozens of riders were at the front and faced the swords of the cultivators several times their number. The arrows and seal weapons falling from above naturally covered them, but these dozens of riders were the ones with the least casualties. As this shaman-like cultivator roared out, thick black mist suddenly pervaded the air in front of him and these dozens of riders. Not only did it block the line of sight above, even the speed at which the arrows fell clearly slowed down. At the same time, the dozen riders around the shaman suddenly sped up and passed through the black mist like lightning. In a flash, the hooves reached the front of the Imperial Guard army. What is this? Seeing this scene, Nangon Kaishu could not help but ask in shock. The shamans of Wuji are cultivators who can use spirit bones to change the climate. The theory is that the bones of some powerful beasts in the plains have naturally accumulated spirit energy. These cultivators can use the bones of these powerful beasts to make powder crystals and other things. Using their vital energy, they form some unique methods. In the beginning, these sorcerers were not murderous cultivators. They were just herdsmen in the wilderness who wanted to change the extreme weather. Later on, the herdsmen who understood this method became sorcerers who protected a nomadic tribe. Their methods were passed down from generation to generation. Ding Ning explained with a calm expression. As he spoke, the dozen galloping horses turned into heavy thuds on the ground. Clearly, they had been killed by the Imperial Guard army and the cultivators at the front of the Imperial Guard army. Yet the howls, the clanging of metal, and the sound of flesh being cut sounded. The black mist had spread to the entire Imperial Guard army, and the sounds were very close to them, as though they were right in front of them. Guofeng stood with an ugly expression on the other side of Ding Ning. The target of these Wuji cultivators was clearly Ding Ning. Ding Ning was the true commander of this battle, and the only weakness at this time. If Ding Ning was assassinated, he did not have the confidence to win this battle. There was a muffled explosion. The black mist ahead suddenly parted. What appeared first was not the figure of any cultivator, but a heavy sealed chariot. Looking at the trembling chariot that had been thrown by a great force, Guofeng's expression grew grave. Yet Ding Ning's eyes narrowed slightly. He did not look at the incoming heavy chariot. He turned and said softly to Nangon Kaishu, "Use the swords I told you about before." Since the battle started, Nangon Kaishu had naturally become Ding Ning's attendant. She knew that Ding Ning, who could kill Palace Attendant Rong, could not be judged in terms of vital energy cultivation. But she also knew that Ding Ning's wounds were so severe that he had not fully recovered. From Ding Ning's soft and calm voice, she sensed that the power that had sent the chariot flying was not just Realm 5. She did not have the confidence to fight someone of this level. Yet at this time, she still stood next to Ding Ning and chose to listen to Ding Ning's words. She attacked with all her power. The sword light was not as strong as usual. A sparkling and translucent stream of water appeared around her. Then, like a sparkling and translucent dragon, it flew forward. This was Cloud Water Palace's sword essence. Cloud Water Palace's sword essence was extremely soft. The glowing flow of water did not collide directly with the flying chariot and just wrapped around it. Clang! There was no enemy, but the sealed chariot gave off an enormous sound like a bell being struck. The glowing flow of water was shattered into countless droplets. Wu Mountain Rain. Ding Ning smiled slightly and said. Nangon Kaishu did not hesitate and attacked a second time, using the sword essence Ding Ning wanted her to use. The shattered droplets of water did not fall. They gently floated into the sky ahead and fell as rain. The rain was not as sharp as the sword essence Zhang he had comprehended in Ink Garden. It did not seem to have much power, but it easily washed away the black mist in the air like dust. The black mist dissipated, and everything was clear. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.